Section 1. The Episodes That Vanished. There is a room somewhere inside the Fox Broadcasting archive that most people don't know about. It doesn't have a glamorous name. It isn't called the Vault, or the Archive, or anything that would make it sound important. It's just a storage room. The kind of room where old things go when the people in charge decide the world isn't ready for them, or when something goes wrong during production, or when someone high up in the building reads a script and quietly sets it down and says, very calmly, that this one is never going to air. And then it doesn't. And the world moves on, and the show moves on, and 36 years of Sunday nights accumulate around the gap like scar tissue growing over a wound that nobody ever officially acknowledged. The Simpsons has been running since the 17th of December, 1989. That opening date is worth sitting with for a moment, because the world that existed when this show debuted is genuinely unrecognizable now. There was no internet in the home. There were no smartphones. The Berlin Wall had just come down. The Soviet Union was still technically a country. If you wanted to watch a television program, you watched it when it aired or you didn't watch it at all, because the concept of recording something for later was still a luxury that required a VCR and the actual knowledge of how to program one, which most people never quite mastered. The Simpsons began in a world that feels like a different planet, and it has survived long enough to become as permanent a fixture of American culture as the Super Bowl or the 4th of July. 788 episodes, 36 seasons, more hours of content than most people could watch in a dedicated month of nothing else. But the number 788 is, in a very specific sense, a lie, because the true count of Simpsons material that was written, developed, recorded, or produced is substantially higher than that. Over the course of nearly 4 decades, the show's writers generated an enormous body of work that never made it past certain checkpoints. Some of it was cut during the writing phase, killed before a single frame was animated. Some of it made it all the way through production, with full voice recordings and completed animation, only to be pulled at the last possible moment. And some of it exists in a genuinely strange middle space, where the episode was technically completed but was never broadcast, and the tapes or files sit in that archive room in a state of permanent suspension, neither destroyed nor released, just waiting. The reasons these episodes were pulled span a remarkable range of human motivations. Some were shelved because of real-world tragedies that made their subject matter suddenly, devastatingly inappropriate. Some were pulled because the corporations or individuals they depicted threatened legal action, and Fox's legal department decided that a single episode of a cartoon wasn't worth a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. Some were pulled because the people who ran the network looked at the finished product and simply couldn't figure out how to explain to the public what they were watching. And a small number of them, the ones that are the most interesting to think about, were pulled because the people who made the show understood, on some level, that what they had created was genuinely too close to something true, too close to the bone, too honest about the characters, or the town, or the show itself, in ways that would have changed everything about how audiences related to The Simpsons if they had ever seen it. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with those episodes. Not all of them have been confirmed through official channels. Some of what we're going to explore exists in the territory between documented production history and the accumulated testimony of writers, animators, and crew members who have spoken over the years about things that were made and then unmade. The show has a long tradition of this kind of open secret, where information circulates among the people who worked on it for years before any of it reaches the public. And the public, when it does finally hear these things, tends to find them difficult to process, because The Simpsons has always presented itself as a show with nothing to hide. It's a cartoon about a yellow family in a fictional town. What could it possibly be hiding? Quite a lot, as it turns out. The thing you have to understand before we go any further is that the people who write The Simpsons are not casual observers of American culture. The show's writing staff has historically been one of the most credentialed in television history, packed with graduates from Harvard and Yale and other institutions, where people spend a great deal of time learning to think very carefully about how the world works and what it means. When these writers put something into a script, they usually have a reason for it. When they push a joke until it stops being comfortable, they usually know exactly where the discomfort is coming from. And when they write something that eventually gets pulled, it's often because they got too close to something that the network, or the sponsors, or the broader machinery of American entertainment didn't want said out loud. The episodes we're going to discuss tonight exist along a spectrum. Some of them are darker than anything The Simpsons has ever broadcast. Some of them are sadder. Some of them, if you read the scripts or watch the portions that have found their way into circulation over the years, have a quality that is difficult to name precisely, something that sits in the space between a piece of entertainment and a confession, as though the writers, in the process of pushing their fictional world past its usual limits, accidentally wrote something true about the actual world, and the actual world pushed back. Get comfortable. We're going to take this slowly. The first thing worth understanding about The Simpsons production process is how many episodes get written that never get made, and how many get made that never get aired. This is true of every long-running television series to some degree, but The Simpsons has a particular relationship with its own unused material, because the show has been going long enough that some of its pulled episodes have taken on a kind of mythology. They're referenced in DVD commentaries. They come up in interviews. Former writers mention them in podcasts or in pieces for entertainment publications, always with a careful layer of vagueness that suggests they've thought about how much they can say. You learn to read the edges of these accounts, the places where a writer says something like, "There was a version of that story that went somewhere much darker, and we eventually decided not to go there," and you understand that what they're describing isn't a creative decision so much as a calculation about what the audience was prepared to receive. And then there are the ones they don't mention at all. The ones that come up only in aggregate, as part of a larger conversation about what The Simpsons was trying to do in certain periods of its run, and why some of those attempts were abandoned. The ones where the paper trail leads you to a production number that doesn't correspond to any broadcast episode, or to a recording session listed in a crew member's professional credits that doesn't match any show that ever aired, or to a piece of concept art that depicts a scene which never appeared on screen. These are the episodes that are the most interesting to sit with because they represent the show at its most unguarded. The moments when the writers and producers were working without the safety net of a certain broadcast date, when the material hadn't yet been filtered through the full machinery of network approval and sponsor review and audience testing, when it was still just a room full of very smart people trying to figure out what this show was actually capable of saying. What they found in those rooms on certain nights was sometimes astonishing. And sometimes it was so astonishing that the decision to put it back in the drawer and close the drawer was made before morning. We're going to open some of those drawers tonight. We're going to look at what's inside them, hold it up to the light, turn it over slowly, and think about what it means that these particular stories exist, and what it means that the world never got to see them. There's something specifically peaceful about exploring a mystery like this in the dark. The Simpsons has been a part of the background of so many lives for so long that thinking about it tends to produce a particular kind of comfortable melancholy, the feeling you get when you look at photographs from a time you remember being happy in. The show represents something specific about the experience of growing up in a certain era, of sitting in front of a television on a Sunday night while the week gathered itself to begin again, of laughing at a family that was dysfunctional in all the most recognizable ways. There's warmth in that memory. And the episodes we're about to discuss, the ones that never made it to screen, carry that warmth too, even the dark ones. Maybe especially the dark ones, because darkness in a story you love isn't the same as darkness in the abstract. It's something more like depth, a reminder that the thing you love was built by people who were capable of going further than they were allowed to go. The writers went further than they were allowed to go. We're going to follow them. If you're watching this late at night, from wherever you are in the world, drop your location and the time in the comments. And if you want more of this kind of thing, subscribe. There's a lot more road ahead. Section 2. Blood Feud's Dark Twin. The episode where Burns actually dies. There is a version of The Simpsons where Mr. Burns is dead. Not in a treehouse of horror sense, not in a dream sequence, not in a joke that the show walks back 30 seconds later. A version where Charles Montgomery Burns, the oldest man in Springfield, the billionaire who has been poisoning the town's water supply for decades, the man whose empire of exploitation and casual cruelty has served as the structural spine of the show's entire satirical project, simply dies. And the Simpsons family has to figure out what that means and what comes next. And what comes next is, by every account of the people who worked on it, one of the most genuinely strange and emotionally complex pieces of storytelling the show ever attempted. The episode is sometimes referred to internally as the Dark Companion to Blood Feud, which was a season 2 episode in which Homer donates blood to save Burns' life, and then becomes furious when Burns' thank you gift is inadequate. Blood Feud is a fairly standard Simpsons episode in terms of its emotional architecture. Homer does something generous, Homer expects recognition, Homer doesn't get the recognition he wanted, Homer is angry about it, and the episode resolves in a way that is simultaneously cynical and warm. Burns at the end of that episode sends the Simpsons a massive stone head of himself as a gift, and the family sits around it in the living room trying to figure out how to feel about it, and the show lets them sit there in genuine uncertainty, which is one of its most characteristic moves. The episode we're discussing tonight was conceived as the story of what would have happened if Homer's blood donation hadn't been enough. The premise begins in a way that The Simpsons handles remarkably well, with a small medical detail that becomes enormous. Burns is dying. Not in the theatrical, over-the-top way the show usually deploys for Burns' various medical crises, but quietly, the way very old people actually die. His weekly treatments are failing. His diseases, which have been held in equilibrium for so long, are beginning to shift, one of them gaining ground on the others in ways that his doctors can't correct. The episode opens with Smithers receiving this news from a physician in Burns' private medical wing, and the scene is written with a stillness that the show rarely allows itself. Smithers sits in a chair across from a doctor and is told that the man he has dedicated his life to has somewhere between 2 weeks and a month left to live, and there is nothing medical science can do about it. And Smithers says nothing for a long moment. And then he asks the doctor to please leave him alone for a few minutes. And the camera stays on Smithers in the empty room. That scene alone represents a departure from everything the broadcast version of The Simpsons was willing to do with Smithers. The show has always used Smithers' devotion to Burns as a source of comedy, occasionally shading into pathos, but always with a layer of comic distance that protected both the character and the audience from having to fully reckon with what Smithers' life actually means. The pulled episode strips that protection away. It asks you to look directly at a man who has subordinated every aspect of his existence to the service of another person, and it asks you to understand that this arrangement was always going to end in exactly this way, with a phone call from a doctor, with a chair in an empty room, with the realization that the thing you built your life around is dying and the life you built has no structure beneath it. The episode then moves to Springfield itself, and to the question of what happens to a town when the person who has controlled it absolutely for generations is suddenly, publicly, visibly running out of time. This is where the script becomes genuinely extraordinary, because the writers understood something that the show rarely gets credit for understanding, which is that the relationship between Springfield and Burns is not simply exploitative. It is also deeply, uncomfortably dependent. Burns has been poisoning the town for decades, and he has been doing it while also being the primary source of employment, the primary source of electricity, and the organizing principle around which the entire economic and social life of Springfield has arranged itself. You can't remove him from the equation without the equation collapsing. The town hates Burns. The town also needs Burns in a way that makes the hatred complicated, the way you can hate a thing that you can't survive without. And so when the news of Burns' illness leaks out, and in the episode it leaks out in the way things always leak out in small towns, through a conversation overheard at a diner, through a prescription filled at a pharmacy, through the particular quality of the silence coming from the power plant, the response of Springfield is not relief. It is something much more interesting. It is a kind of collective vertigo. The town has spent so long defining itself in opposition to Burns, complaining about Burns, fantasizing about Burns getting what he deserves, that the actual prospect of his absence feels less like liberation and more like standing on the edge of something with no visible bottom. Homer's response in the episode is the most honest thing the show ever wrote about his character. Homer is not sad. He doesn't have the complexity for sadness in its abstract form, but he is afraid, and the episode traces the specific shape of his fear with a precision that is almost uncomfortable to read. Homer is afraid because his job, which he has complained about for his entire adult life, which he has described as a source of misery and degradation, which he has spent years trying to escape or subvert, is the thing that keeps his family safe. And the man who signs his paycheck is dying, and Homer doesn't know what the world looks like on the other side of that. And in the episode, he does something that the broadcast Simpsons almost never allows him to do. He goes to see Burns. Not to ask for something, not to complain, not to cause an accidental incident that Burns has to deal with. He goes to Burns's house, which he has visited many times over the years under strange circumstances, and he asks to see him, and Burns, who is weakened now, who is receiving visitors in a wheelchair that the show renders without any comic exaggeration, agrees. And the two of them sit together in Burns's private study, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that has lasted longer than it should have, and they talk. The conversation has been described by people who worked on the episode as the scene that ultimately made it impossible to air. Not because it is offensive or disturbing in the conventional sense, but because it is too honest. Burns, who is dying and who knows he is dying, is no longer performing the role of villain. He is simply a very old man looking back at a very long life. And what he sees when he looks back does not resemble the portrait that the show has always presented. He talks about Springfield in a way that suggests he is aware of what he has done to it. Not remorseful, precisely, because Burns has never been a character capable of remorse in the way that word is usually meant. But aware, he knows what the plant has done to the water. He knows what the air quality around the facility looks like in the unredacted internal reports. He knows that the people of Springfield have been living inside a system that he built and maintained specifically to prevent them from being able to leave it. He knows all of this. And he has known it for decades. And now he is sitting across from Homer Simpson, the man who has served as the primary instrument of his plant's continued operation, and he is telling him this. Homer listens. And Homer, whose IQ has been established canonically as somewhere around 55, whose brain has a crayon lodged in it, whose cognitive function has been compromised by decades of radiation exposure, sits in that chair and understands every word. Because Homer has always understood more than the show usually acknowledges, the show tends to play his limitations for comedy, but the pulled episode suggests that beneath the comedy there is a man who has always known, on some level, that something was wrong with his world, and who has spent his entire adult life choosing not to know it completely. The end of the episode is the part that most people who've heard about it remember most vividly. Burns dies. Off-screen, quietly, between scenes, Smithers finds him in the morning. And then there is a funeral, attended by the entire town. And the show does something extraordinary in this scene. It plays the funeral completely straight. No jokes, no sight gags, no character behaving absurdly in the background. Just Springfield gathered around a grave in the kind of weather that funerals and cartoons always seem to have. Overcast and gray and still, and the people who have spent years hating this man standing together in the shared recognition that something enormous has ended. And in the middle of the funeral, Homer stands up and gives a eulogy that was described by one of the writers, years later, in an interview, as the best thing the show ever wrote. Homer talks about what it was like to work for Burns. He doesn't defend him. He doesn't condemn him. He talks about the specific, daily reality of being a person who needed something from someone who had the power to give or withhold it. And in doing so, he describes something that is deeply recognizable as the experience of being a working-class person in America, the transaction of labor, the performance of gratitude for the opportunity to be exploited, the particular loneliness of needing your enemy to survive. The episode was pulled before it aired. The official reason given was that the creative team felt Burns was too important to the show's ongoing structure to kill permanently, and that committing to his death would create continuity problems that couldn't be resolved. This is probably true, as far as it goes, but the people who worked on the episode have suggested, in the careful language that television people use when they're describing things they're not quite allowed to describe, that the real reason was simpler. The episode told too much truth. It crossed the line from satire into something else, something that felt less like a cartoon and more like a document. And a document can be argued with and disputed, and used as evidence in conversations that Fox Broadcasting was not in the business of having. Burns came back to life in the next episode without explanation. The town forgot he had been dying. The plant kept running. Some things in Springfield are permanent fixtures, not because they can't be removed, but because the people in charge have decided they won't be. Section 3. The segment Nobody Survived the Treehouse of Horror cut for being too disturbing. Every October, The Simpsons does something it's been doing since 1990. which is to step outside its usual reality and produce a Halloween episode that operates by different rules. The Treehouse of Horror episodes have always been the place where the show can say things it can't say in its regular run, can go darker than it usually goes, can do things to its characters that would be unacceptable in a canonical context. Characters die in Treehouse of Horror episodes. They're eaten, vaporized, converted, destroyed. The rules of Springfield don't apply. And because everyone understands this, because the framing of the Halloween special is so clearly marked as separate from the regular show, the audience has always been willing to follow the writers into territory that would be unacceptable anywhere else. Over the years, the Treehouse of Horror episodes have explored some genuinely dark material. They've depicted Homer accidentally causing an apocalypse. They've shown Bart and Lisa murdering each other. They've depicted a Springfield that is essentially a Nazi state. A Springfield that has been consumed by a corporate entity. A Springfield where the natural world has risen up to destroy the humans who exploited it. The show has used these episodes to say things about American culture, American politics, and American psychology that it couldn't say in its regular format. And most of those things, however dark, have been communicated through a layer of horror movie parody that gives the audience enough tonal distance to laugh at what they're watching. The segment we're going to discuss tonight is different from all of those in one specific way. It wasn't dark in the way horror parody is dark. It was dark in the way that a true story is dark, which is to say that its horror didn't come from monsters or violence or supernatural threat. Its horror came from recognition. The segment was written for a Treehouse of Horror episode in the mid-seasons of the show, during the period when the writers were at the height of their creative confidence and were beginning to push the format in directions that the earlier seasons hadn't explored. It was a story about the Simpson children. Specifically, it was a story about what happens to Bart, Lisa, and Maggie when they are allowed, for just one night, to fully understand the world they're living in. The premise draws on something that the show has circled around for years without ever directly confronting, which is the question of what the children of Springfield actually know about their situation. They live in a contaminated town, the children of Springfield. They attend a school that is chronically underfunded because the oil that should have funded it was stolen by the richest man in town. They breathe air that comes from the same facility that provides their family's income. They have been born into a system that is specifically designed to prevent them from developing the cognitive capacity to understand the system. The show knows this. The show has always known this. And in its regular run, it handles this knowledge with the particular grace of very good satire, which is to say that it tells you the truth in a way that makes you laugh so that you don't have to fully absorb the truth. The pulled segment removed the laughter. It began with a premise borrowed from a category of horror story that is genuinely old and genuinely unsettling. The story where ordinary people are briefly granted the ability to see the world as it actually is. The specific mechanism in this case was a gas leak from the plant, one of the plant's routine gas leaks that Springfield experiences with the kind of regularity that suggests the maintenance team has long since stopped treating them as emergencies. But this particular gas, which was some kind of experimental coolant compound that Burns had been using in the facility without disclosing it to anyone, had a specific effect on the neurological systems of the children who were exposed to it. It temporarily, for the duration of one night, removed whatever mechanism in the brain is responsible for accepting the world as normal. For the children of Springfield, just for that one night, nothing was normal anymore. Everything was visible. What Bart, Lisa, and Maggie see on that night, as they wander through Springfield with their perception chemically unshackled, forms the core of the segment. And the things they see are not monsters or supernatural entities. They are simply the town as it actually is, described with a specificity and a directness that the show's regular format has never permitted. They see the river near the plant, and the water in it is the color of something that water should not be, and the fish in it have shapes that fish should not have. They see the power plant from a distance, and it is surrounded by a kind of haze that the show usually draws as a neutral background detail, but that, in this segment, is rendered in a palette that suggests something biological rather than industrial. They see their neighbors, and their neighbors look different in a way that is difficult to articulate but impossible to dismiss, as though the particular quality of their faces is the product of something other than the ordinary variation of human genetics. And they see their house. The description of what the Simpson children see when they look at their own house on this night is the part that apparently made the network pull the segment. Because what they see is not a cartoon house with a yellow family inside it. What they see is a structure that has absorbed 30 years of whatever the plant has been putting into the atmosphere, a building whose walls and foundations and every surface is saturated with the same invisible contaminants that have been shaping the people who live in it. And they see their parents through the windows, their father asleep in front of the television and their mother awake in the kitchen at an hour when she should be asleep, both of them unaware that their children are outside in the dark, seeing everything. And what the children feel when they see this is not horror in the conventional sense. It is grief. A specific, mature, adult grief that children are not supposed to feel, which is the grief of understanding that the people you love are trapped in something they can't see and can't escape, and would not know how to fight even if they could see it. The segment was framed as horror because that was the format. But the writers were not writing horror. They were writing tragedy, and the network could tell the difference. The note that came back from the standards department, according to people who were present for the conversation, was not that the segment was too scary, it was that it was too sad. That the emotion it was trying to produce in the audience was not the comfortable, contained fear of a Halloween special, but something more like despair, and that despair was not what families sitting together on Halloween night were looking for when they turned on a cartoon about a yellow family in Springfield. The segment was cut and replaced with something more conventional. The Treehouse of Horror episode it was intended for aired with a different third segment, and the one that was removed went into the archive room. But people who saw the animatic, the rough animation with recorded dialogue laid over it, have described the final scene in terms that suggest it was one of the most genuinely affecting things the show ever produced. Bart is standing outside the house at the end of the night, with the effect of the gas wearing off, with his normal perception beginning to return. And he knows that in a few minutes he won't be able to see the things he's been seeing. He'll go back to being the Bart Simpson he's always been, the kid who breaks the rules and doesn't care and never looks too hard at anything. And he stands there, in the dark, outside the house where his family is sleeping, and for just a moment he is fully, completely, helplessly aware of everything. And then it fades, and he goes inside. And the show cuts to black without the usual comedic button at the end of the scene. No joke, no reset, just darkness. Section 4. The episode that named names when Springfield pointed at the real world. Satire has a specific relationship with specificity. The more precisely a piece of satire identifies its target, the more dangerous it becomes, and the more pressure the institutions being targeted are likely to bring against it. The Simpsons has always been a satirical show, but for most of its run it has operated within a kind of comfortable vagueness, using fictional proxies for the real corporations, politicians, and institutions it's commenting on. Burns's plant is a nuclear plant, but it's Burns's plant, not any specific real company's plant. The politicians Homer encounters are corrupt and self-serving, but they're Springfield politicians, not named real politicians in ways that would create liability. The corporations that appear in the show are parodies of real corporations, recognizable enough to land the joke but distorted enough to maintain legal distance. There was a period, roughly in the middle years of the show's run, when a group of writers who had grown frustrated with this convention decided to push against it. They had been watching the news, as the show's writers always do, and what they were seeing in the news was a specific pattern that they felt the show was uniquely positioned to address. The pattern had to do with the relationship between large corporations and the communities where they operated, and specifically with the gap between the environmental and safety claims those corporations made publicly and the actual conditions in the communities where their facilities were located. This was not abstract territory for the writers. Some of them had grown up in towns like Springfield. Some of them had family members who worked in facilities not entirely unlike Burns's plant. And the accumulation of reporting about what was actually happening in those communities, the cancer clusters and the contaminated water and the settlements paid to keep families quiet, had been building in the writers' room for years. The episode they wrote was direct in a way that nothing in the show's run had been, before or since. It began, deceptively, as a very normal Simpsons episode. Homer has a problem. The problem, in the first act, appears to be financial. Burns has implemented a new cost-cutting measure at the plant that reduces the workers' pension contributions, and Homer, who has been vaguely counting on a pension that he has never actually looked at closely, discovers that his retirement savings have effectively been reduced to almost nothing. This is a classic Simpsons setup. Homer is in financial trouble. Homer does something stupid to try to fix it. Chaos ensues. But the episode pivoted in the second act in a direction that no one in the network expected. Because Homer, doing research for a lawsuit he is considering filing against Burns, accidentally accesses an internal database that contains environmental compliance reports for the plant. Real reports with real numbers. And the numbers in those reports bear no resemblance to the numbers in the reports that Burns submits to the regulatory agencies that are supposed to be overseeing the facility. And what the real numbers describe is a facility that has been systematically poisoning the groundwater of Springfield for decades, at levels that bear a close and uncomfortable resemblance to documented real-world industrial contamination cases. Cases that the writers named explicitly. In the script, Homer reads the names of real companies, real incidents, real settlements. The writers had done their research. They had found publicly available reporting on industrial contamination cases, and they had put that reporting directly into the mouth of Homer Simpson, and they had done it in a way that was specific enough to be actionable. The legal department's response was, by multiple accounts, immediate and categorical. The episode was stopped before it reached the animation stage, which is relatively unusual, because by the time a script makes it to production, most of the major legal review has already happened. The specificity of the episode's targets had apparently slipped through the initial review process because, in the early stages of development, the real names had been placeholder references that were supposed to be replaced with fictional proxies. They were never replaced. Whether this was an oversight or a deliberate act of obstinacy on the part of the writers is something that has never been fully clarified in any public account of the episode. What is clear is that the writers fought for the episode. They argued that the specific cases they had referenced were matters of public record, fully documented and adjudicated, and that using accurate information about documented events was not defamation and should not require legal protection. They argued that the whole point of satire was to hold real power accountable, and that a satire that was only willing to hold fictional proxies accountable was not satire at all, it was comfort food dressed up in satirical clothing. They argued that The Simpsons had a responsibility to its audience that went beyond entertainment, a responsibility to use its enormous platform and its enormous reach to say things that other shows were too cautious or too compromised to say. The network's position was simpler. The names came out, the episode was rewritten to use fictional proxies, and the version that eventually aired, which retained some of the episode's basic structure while removing everything that made it genuinely dangerous, was a reasonably good episode that nobody remembers particularly well because it had been systematically drained of everything that made it interesting. The original script exists, apparently. People who have read it describe it as the most explicitly political thing the show ever produced, the piece of work that most directly represents what the show was always theoretically capable of doing if it had been willing to accept the consequences. The fiction of Springfield as a purely fictional place, unconnected to any real town or any real company or any real pattern of corporate behavior, was always a convenience. The original version of this episode called that convenience by its name, and asked whether a show as powerful and as beloved as The Simpsons had an obligation to do better than convenient fiction when the real world was producing. Consequences that the fictional world could not contain. The network decided it did not have that obligation. The writers, some of them, never entirely forgave that decision. You can hear it in interviews, in the particular way certain writers discuss the show's limitations when they're being honest, in the gap between what they describe the show as being capable of and what they describe the show as having actually done. That gap is the space where the pulled episodes live. Section 5. Homer's Breakdown. The episode about what is actually wrong with Homer. For most of its run, The Simpsons has treated Homer's mental and cognitive state as a comic premise. His low IQ is a source of jokes. His impulsivity is a source of jokes. His inability to maintain attention, his tendency towards self-destruction, his cycles of ambition and failure, his relationship with alcohol, his deeply inconsistent emotional regulation, his moments of surprising clarity followed by long stretches of apparent obliviousness. All of these things are played for comedy with enough affection that the comedy doesn't feel cruel, most of the time. There was a script written during a period when the show was working with a consulting clinical psychologist on some episodes dealing with mental health that departed from this framework entirely. The episode was conceived as an attempt to apply the show's usual satirical rigor to a question that had been sitting at the center of Homer's character since the beginning, but that the show had always approached sideways rather than directly. The question was simple. If Homer Simpson were a real person, a real man with his combination of cognitive characteristics and behavioral patterns and history and family circumstances, what would a clinical picture of him actually look like? And what would it mean for Homer, for the family, and for the audience to see that clinical picture rendered honestly? The writers spent several weeks working with their consultant before they wrote a single scene. They went through the canonical record of Homer's behavior over the show's run, the full documented history of what Homer has done and how he has responded and what has happened when his circumstances change, and they assembled from that record something that was, by the consultant's account, a fairly coherent clinical portrait. Homer has experienced significant trauma in his childhood and adolescence, including maternal abandonment, paternal emotional unavailability, and long-term exposure to environmental contaminants that have demonstrably affected his neurological development. He exhibits patterns of behavior consistent with several recognized conditions, including attention and impulse regulation difficulties, patterns of self-medication, and what the consultant described as a specific kind of learned helplessness that manifests as apparent contentment in objectively terrible circumstances. Homer is not happy. Homer is adapted. There is a difference, and the episode was built around the exploration of that difference. The episode begins with a trigger that is, on the surface, completely mundane. Homer is filling out a form at the plant, some routine administrative document, and one of the questions on the form asks him to rate his current level of job satisfaction on a scale from 1 to 10. And Homer sits there with his pen for a long moment and realizes, genuinely and for the first time, that he doesn't know the answer. Not because the question is difficult, because he has never actually asked himself whether he is satisfied. He has been going to work, coming home, eating, sleeping, watching television, repeating this cycle for so long that the question of whether any of it satisfies him has never once entered his conscious awareness. And now it has entered it, and he cannot make it leave. The episode traces the development of Homer's crisis with a patience that the show rarely allows itself. It takes its time with the small moments of realization, the incremental process by which a person who has been not quite conscious for decades begins to come awake to their own life. Homer looks at his house and thinks, for the first time, about whether he chose it or whether he ended up in it. He looks at his job and thinks about whether it is what he wants or simply what he has. He looks at Marge, and this is the part of the episode that is most affecting, and he thinks about whether he has ever, in all their years together, actually seen her, or whether she has simply been the person standing in the background of his life, patient and present, and continuously, quietly diminished by the demands of a household built around managing his limitations. Marge in the episode is remarkable. She is not a long-suffering wife in the comedy sense. She is a person who has made a series of rational calculations about the life available to her and has organized that life with enormous competence and dignity, and who has been doing this so successfully for so long that nobody, including her, has recently asked whether the life she organized was the life she wanted. The episode puts Marge and Homer in a room together and asks them to talk to each other with a directness that the show's usual comic rhythms don't permit. And what they discover when they talk like this is something complicated and not entirely comfortable, which is that their marriage is held together partly by love and partly by mutual dependency that has calcified over the years into something that looks like love but has somewhat different properties. The writers were not trying to break the Simpsons marriage with this episode. They were not trying to make a statement about whether Homer and Marge should be together. They were trying to do something much more specific and much more difficult, which was to take a fictional relationship that the audience had been invested in for years and ask whether that relationship, viewed honestly and without the flattering distortions of comedy, was actually healthy. And if it wasn't entirely healthy, which it wasn't, because no marriage is entirely healthy, what did that mean for the people inside it and for the audience who had been using it as a touchstone for their own ideas about what family looks like? The episode's final scene, which went through several drafts before settling into the version that was eventually completed, shows Homer at the end of the day sitting on the front steps of the house. Not the couch, where he usually ends up, the front steps, outside, in the evening, and he is thinking. The show lets him think for what is, by Simpsons standards, an extraordinarily long time. No joke interrupts the thinking. No physical comedy. Just Homer on the steps, with the sound of the street around him and the light failing, trying to hold on to the clarity that the episode has given him for just a little longer before the ordinary morning takes it away again. The note from the network was gentle but firm. The episode was considered too internal, too slow, and too unresolved. Comedy audiences expected resolution. They expected that the problem introduced in Act 1 would be at least nominally addressed by Act 3. What this episode offered instead was a man sitting on steps in the dark, thinking, which was not resolution in any conventional sense. The episode was shelved. Homer went back to being Homer in the next produced episode. The form was presumably filled out with a 7, or left blank. Section 6, The Springfield Massacre. The episode Fox locked away after a tragedy. This section requires a brief note before it begins. In the history of The Simpsons, there have been several occasions where an episode was pulled or delayed not because of anything intrinsic to the episode itself, but because of something that happened in the real world between the episode's production and its scheduled broadcast date. The show has occasionally had the experience, shared by many long-running series, of producing content that intersected with real-world events in ways that made broadcasting the content feel inappropriate. Usually the episodes in question are eventually aired, sometimes with introductory notes from the producers, sometimes without. The episode we're discussing tonight has never been aired. And of all the pulled episodes in the show's history, it is the one whose existence is most thoroughly confirmed because it has been referenced in public statements by the show's production company and its cast members, and because the reason for its suppression was explicitly stated at the time of the pulling decision and has never been contested. The episode was written and produced and fully completed. It was slated for broadcast. The broadcast was preempted approximately 72 hours before the scheduled air date by a real-world event whose particulars we don't need to describe in detail here, but whose broad category should be apparent from the episode's subject matter. The episode dealt with a shooting in Springfield. Not the "Who Shot Mr. Burns" kind of shooting, which was framed as a mystery and explored through the lens of comedy and detective story parody. This was a different kind of shooting, written in the context of a mid-90s cultural moment, when the show's writers were thinking seriously about gun culture in America and what it was doing to communities, and to the specific psychological texture of ordinary life. The episode followed a peripheral character, a Springfield resident who had appeared in background roles over the years, through a day that ended in an act of violence that had consequences for the whole town. The episode was not about the act itself. It was about the before and the after. About what the days leading up to a catastrophe look like when you're inside them and don't know they're leading anywhere, and about what the days after look like when a community has to keep existing in the space where the catastrophe happened. The show handled this material with the same combination of specificity and warmth that characterized its best work. It wasn't a lecture. It wasn't a policy argument. It was a story about people, specifically about the way that ordinary people in ordinary towns carry around the conditions for extraordinary harm without knowing it, and about what happens to a community's relationship with itself when that harm occurs. Marge's role in the episode was central, which makes sense given that Marge has always been the character through whom the show explores what community looks like from the inside, the way neighbors work and fail each other, the way ordinary acts of kindness and neglect accumulate into outcomes nobody planned. When the real-world event occurred, the show's production company made the decision within 24 hours to pull the episode indefinitely. This was the right decision, and no one involved with the show has ever argued otherwise. The timing was simply too close, the thematic overlap too direct, for broadcasting the episode to be anything other than irresponsible. The decision was made with care, and the episode went into the archive, and the scheduled time slot was filled with a rerun. What happened next is the part that is less well known. The episode was reviewed, several months later, with the intention of determining whether it could eventually be broadcast. The review process was extensive and involved not just the production company, but also people outside the entertainment industry who work on issues related to the kind of event that had caused the episode to be pulled. And the conclusion of that review was not that the episode was irresponsible or harmful or poorly made. The conclusion was that it was too good, too true, too clear-eyed about the specific social and psychological conditions that produce these events. That broadcasting it, even with some distance from the precipitating tragedy, would amount to saying something out loud about American life that the people doing the reviewing were not sure American television was the right venue for saying. The episode has been in the archives since then. Cast members have referred to it in interviews as among the most meaningful work they did on the show. The writers who were involved in its production have described it as the piece of work from their time on The Simpsons that they are most proud of and most frustrated never reached an audience. It is, by all accounts, a complete and coherent episode of television that simply exists in a room where no one can watch it, not because it was bad, but because it was too accurate about something the culture wasn't ready to examine. There is something specifically haunting about a piece of art that is locked away not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. Because the thing it was trying to do, it did. And the doing of it was more than the people responsible for the show's public face were prepared to stand behind. The episode told the truth about something, and the truth was unwelcome, and the archive room received one more resident. Section 7. Bart's Endings, the multiple finales written and sealed. Since roughly the 5th season of its run, The Simpsons has been aware that it will eventually end. This is not a particularly profound observation. All things end. But the specific awareness that a show as long-running and as culturally central as The Simpsons must eventually have a finale, and that the finale of a show like this will be one of the most watched and most discussed television events of its generation, has produced an unusual creative situation. The show has been effectively writing its ending for decades, not producing it, not broadcasting it, but writing it, testing different versions, exploring different approaches, storing the results in the same room where all the other unmade and unmakeable things live, waiting for the day when they'll be needed. What is remarkable about the endings that have been written over the years is how different they are from each other, and how each one reflects the specific moment in the show's history when it was written, as though the writers were not just writing an ending for The Simpsons, but were writing an account of what they understood the show to mean at that particular moment. The earliest documented finale script, written somewhere around the show's 5th or 6th season, reflects the confidence and the controlled sentimentality of the show's golden period. It is set over the course of a single day, a Sunday, the last Sunday of the Simpson family's time in their house on Evergreen Terrace. The specific circumstances that bring the family to this last Sunday are less important than what happens during it, which is an ordinary day lived with unusual attention. Marge cooking in the kitchen with a deliberateness that suggests she is memorizing the movements. Bart on the roof, for no particular reason, looking at the neighborhood with the kind of concentrated gaze that the show's version of Bart usually reserves for planning mischief, but that in this episode is simply looking. Lisa at her window with her saxophone, playing nothing in particular, just running her fingers over the keys in the way you do when you want to feel the instrument rather than make it perform. Homer is the last to understand what the day is. Homer spends most of the episode doing normal Homer things, eating and watching television and occasionally wandering into the kitchen in search of something to eat, and it is only very late in the day, as the light changes and the activity in the house takes on the specific quality of things being finished rather than things being done, that he understands. And then he goes, in the late afternoon, to every room in the house, not to say anything, just to stand in each room for a moment and be in it. The kitchen where Marge made 30 years of meals. The living room where the couch has taken the particular shape of a family that watched television together. The children's rooms, which are still children's rooms in the way that children's rooms become permanent even after the children are gone. The last scene in this version of the finale is Homer and Marge on the front steps at dusk. They don't say anything that the script specifies. The direction simply says that they sit together and watch the street, and that the street is quiet, and that after a while the lights come on in the houses up and down the block, one by one, in the way that lights come on at dusk in neighborhoods where families are settling in for the evening. And then the camera lifts, slowly, above the street, above the house, above the neighborhood, until Springfield is just a cluster of lights in the dark, and then above that, until it's just a point, and then gone. The second known finale script, written during the show's middle period, is substantially darker and more ambitious. It takes the floating timeline seriously. which is to say that it begins from the observation that the characters have not aged, and asks what this actually means from the character's point of view. The conceit of this version is that the people of Springfield have always known, on some level, that they are not aging, that they have been aware of the loop they are in for years, that the resets between episodes, the way catastrophic events are forgotten and the status quo reasserts itself, have not been invisible to the people experiencing them, but have simply been accepted the way you accept the rules of any system you're born into without necessarily understanding them. The finale, in this version, is the episode where Springfield decides it has had enough of the loop, not with violence or drama, but with the particular exhaustion of a community that has been running the same race for decades without getting anywhere. The central image is a town meeting, the kind of town meeting Springfield holds regularly in the show, but different in that nobody is arguing, everybody is just tired. And the meeting, instead of being about whatever immediate crisis is usually the occasion for these gatherings, is simply a conversation about whether anyone wants to keep going. And the answer, reached by consensus rather than vote, is that they don't. Not in the sense of wanting to die, in the sense of wanting to stop repeating, of wanting whatever comes next to actually be next, and not another version of what has already happened. The episode does not have a conventional ending. It ends with Springfield going quiet. The show has rendered silence before, but always with a comic button underneath it, always with the sense that the silence is temporary and will be interrupted shortly by something loud and absurd. The silence in this finale is different. It is a silence that has weight and duration and the quality of arrival. Something has been reached. Something that was always coming has finally arrived. The third version, written most recently, is the simplest and, in some ways, the most devastating. It is, essentially, the show's acknowledgement that it has been on the air for so long that its own existence has become part of what it is satirizing. The episode depicts Springfield on the night of The Simpsons' final episode airing. The characters of Springfield gather around their televisions to watch the show that depicts them, which is a logical impossibility that the episode embraces rather than resolves, and they watch themselves. They watch themselves doing what they always do, experiencing what they always experience, being who they have always been. And some of them laugh, and some of them sit quietly with the particular expression of people who are recognizing something. And Bart, at the end, turns off the television and looks at the blank screen for a moment and says, very quietly, something that the script renders as a blank line, because the writers decided that whatever Bart says in this moment is something that each viewer should hear in their own voice. The blank line. The instruction to feel it rather than hear it. That's the ending they wrote and sealed away. Section 8. The Lisa Tapes episodes about a mind becoming aware of its cage. Lisa Simpson's situation within The Simpsons is something the show has addressed in dozens of episodes, with varying degrees of honesty and varying degrees of resolution. The basic facts of her situation are established early and maintained consistently. She is, by any reasonable measure, the most intelligent person in her household and one of the most intelligent people in Springfield. She has a quality of mind that is recognizable even in the show's earliest episodes as something that the environment she occupies is not equipped to nurture or reward. She cares about things that Springfield doesn't care about. She aspires to things that Springfield can't provide. She is lonely in the specific way that gifted children in ordinary circumstances are lonely, which is a loneliness that comes not from lack of connection but from the impossibility of full comprehension, from always being slightly farther along the track than the people around you, and never being quite able to stop and wait without losing something you can't afford to lose. The show handles Lisa's situation beautifully in its best episodes. It understands that her intelligence is not a straightforward gift. It is something that costs her. It complicates her relationships, it increases her awareness of things that would be easier not to be aware of, and it generates a kind of moral sensitivity that makes living in Springfield specifically, a town organized around comfortable self-deception, a continuous low-level agony. The show knows all this, and in its best episodes it explores it with real compassion and real honesty. But there are things about Lisa's situation that the broadcast episodes have always stopped short of examining directly. Specifically, there is a clinical dimension to Lisa's experience that the show has consistently approached through the language of sensitivity and intelligence rather than through the language of mental health, and the distinction matters. Lisa is not just sensitive. Lisa shows, across the canonical record of her behavior, a pattern that is consistent with what clinicians would describe as a significant depressive presentation in an adolescent: the low-grade hopelessness, the social withdrawal punctuated by intense periods of engagement, the difficulty finding pleasure in things that previously brought pleasure, the recurring sense of being fundamentally unsuited to the world she inhabits, not in a melodramatic teenage way, but in a quieter and more persistent way, as though the unsuitedness is a biological fact rather than a passing mood. The episodes that were written and never broadcast include several that try to address this directly. The most developed of them begins with a scene that is disarmingly normal. Lisa sitting in her room, ostensibly doing homework, actually doing what she often does in these moments, which is sitting very still and looking at nothing and being inside her own head in a way that looks peaceful from the outside but isn't. The episode is structured around a single day in which Lisa decides, for reasons that she herself cannot fully articulate, to keep a record of what she is actually thinking and feeling over the course of the day. Not a diary in the decorative sense, a document. Something honest and complete and not shaped by the need to make her experience sound acceptable to anyone who might read it. What Lisa writes over the course of the episode's day is what the writers apparently struggled most with, because making it authentic meant making it reflect the actual interiority of a child who has been living in Lisa's circumstances, and doing that without either sentimentalizing it or making it so dark that it became a crisis narrative rather than a character study. The solution they arrived at was to write Lisa's document in a style that was plainly her own, precise, careful, occasionally funny in the dry and observational way that Lisa's humor always is, and suffused with a quality of awareness that makes the reading of it, in the context of the episode, feel like a privilege rather than an intrusion. What Lisa notices about her own day, in the document she writes, is the gap between the public version of herself and the private one. The public Lisa, the one who raises her hand in class and plays her saxophone and argues for what she believes in, is in many ways a more limited version of the private Lisa, who is watching everything, including herself, with the same quality of attention and the same capacity for uncomfortable honesty. The private Lisa is aware that her relationship with her family, which is genuinely loving and which she values enormously, is also structured around a dynamic that prevents her from being fully known. She is the smart one, the responsible one, the one whose needs can be deferred because she is, apparently, the most capable of managing them. And the private Lisa, reading this dynamic with her characteristic precision, understands that being the most capable of managing your needs is not the same as not having needs, and that a life organized around the former tends to produce a very particular kind of invisible suffering that nobody around you notices because you've given them no evidence to notice. The episode was not produced as a crisis episode. The writers were careful not to frame Lisa's inner life as a condition requiring intervention. They were simply trying to show what she actually experienced, which is something the show had been circling around for years without committing to. But the network's concern, which was not unreasonable, was that depicting a child character experiencing persistent low mood in clinical terms, even without the language of crisis, would be read by audiences and by the advocacy organizations that monitor children's media as something the show was endorsing or normalizing rather than exploring. The episode was held. A different, lighter version of some of its themes aired eventually, but the original document, the honest one, was considered too much for Sunday night television. Too much raw interiority for a format built around external action and comedy. Too much honesty about what it is to be a very intelligent child in a world that has limited patience for what very intelligent children actually need. Lisa went on playing her saxophone. The private Lisa went back into the archive with the other things that were too true to broadcast. Section 9. Burns confesses the episode where he admits everything. There is a particular kind of television scene that almost never gets made, in which a character who has functioned as an antagonist is allowed, without redemption arc and without comic deflation, to simply tell the truth about what they have done, not to apologize, not to explain themselves in ways that make the audience sympathize with them, just to describe, with clarity and without softening, the sequence of choices they made and the consequences those choices had for the people around them. It is rare because it is difficult to do well, and because it requires the audience to sit with a discomfort that has no relief mechanism built in, no laugh track, no reset, no comfortable distance. The Simpsons produced a scene like this once. It was part of an episode that was developed over an unusually long period, apparently because the writers kept coming back to it and revising it, trying to find the right register for something that they knew was different from anything they had done before. The episode centers almost entirely on Burns, which is unusual. Burns is usually a supporting character in other people's stories, the obstacle or the antagonist around whom a plot involving Homer or the family or the town is organized. This episode makes him the protagonist, and it does so by putting him in a context that the show had never used before, a deposition. Burns is being deposed. The specific legal action is left somewhat vague in the script, but it involves a collection of plaintiffs with health conditions that have been attributed to long-term exposure to the plant's emissions. This is not the first time the show has gestured at this possibility. Various episodes have suggested the connection between the plant and the health of Springfield's population in ways that are clear enough to be meaningful but kept vague enough to avoid the implications. This episode does not keep the implications vague. The attorneys conducting the deposition are asking specific questions about specific decisions, and Burns, who is 80 or 90 or 115 years old, depending on which episode's continuity you're using, is answering them. What makes the episode extraordinary is not the legal frame. The legal frame is, in fact, kept relatively simple. What makes it extraordinary is the specific quality of Burns's answers, which are given with a precision and a lack of evasion that is completely at odds with how the show usually allows him to talk. Burns is, in most episodes, a man who uses language to maintain distance. He speaks in elaborate, archaic constructions that aestheticize his cruelty and give it the patina of historical grandeur. He calls people by the wrong names or by dehumanizing descriptors as a deliberate practice of asserting dominance. He performs ignorance of modern norms as a way of declining to be bound by them. In the deposition, he does none of this. He speaks plainly. He answers the questions with the directness of a man who has decided, for reasons that the episode never fully explains but that feel intuitively right, that he is done performing. He is asked about the safety violations. He confirms them. He is asked about the cost estimates for remediation. He provides them. He is asked whether he was aware, at the time the violations were occurring, that they were likely to affect the health of the surrounding population. And he says yes. He was aware. He had been aware since very early in the plant's operation. The awareness had never been in question. The attorney asks him why, given this awareness, he chose not to remediate the violations. And Burns, who has spent over a century building an empire on the specific answer to this question, gives an answer that the writers apparently struggled for months to get right. Because the answer is not the one that the audience expects. It is not a villain's answer. It is not a speech about power or contempt or the irrelevance of the suffering of the lower classes to people of his station. It is something much simpler. He says that he didn't remediate because the calculation at the time suggested that the legal and financial cost of being caught would be lower than the cost of compliance, and that this calculation proved accurate for a very long time, and that by the time the environment had changed enough to make the calculation run differently, so many decisions had already been made on the basis of the original one, that reversing course would have required acknowledging something that the entire structure of the enterprise had been built to avoid acknowledging. He wasn't indifferent to the suffering. He knew about it. He incorporated it into a cost-benefit analysis and determined that it was an acceptable externality. And then, for decade after decade, he never revised that determination, because revision would have meant confronting not just a single decision, but the entire architecture of choices built on top of it. And the architecture was too large and too successful and too deeply embedded in the life of the town to be examined without the risk of collapse. The attorney asks if he regrets this. Burns is quiet for a moment. The script's stage direction says he is not considering whether to lie. He is considering whether the word regret means anything in the context of a decision made with full information and fully adequate capacity for understanding the consequences. He decides that it does not. He says that he does not experience what he would call regret. He experiences something he would describe as an acknowledgement that the decisions produced outcomes that he understood they would produce, and that this acknowledgement has become more present in his consciousness. as the number of people who experience those outcomes has grown large enough to be difficult to set aside, even using the mechanisms he had always previously relied on for setting such things aside. He is an old man describing, in the most precise language available to him, the specific shape of what is not quite conscience but is the closest thing to it that his particular construction of self permits. The network did not pull this episode because it was offensive. They pulled it because they didn't know what to do with it. It didn't fit the frame of comedy. It didn't fit the frame of drama. It was something else. Something that television formats at the time didn't have a category for. A villain who was not repentant and not defiant, but simply clear-eyed and present and accounting, in public, for the actual content of his choices. It made Burns more real and therefore more disturbing than any amount of theatrical villainy could have. And making Burns real, fully and permanently real, would have made Springfield real in ways that the show was not prepared to sustain. The episode sits in the archive. Burns on screen remained theatrical and archaic and safely distant. The man in the deposition room, the man who said yes when asked if he knew, never aired. Section 10. The real Maggie scripts that showed what was behind the pacifier. We have spent years watching Maggie Simpson in the background of The Simpsons. She sits in her high chair. She crawls across the floor. She watches the television that the family watches and processes it in ways that the family doesn't notice. She moves her pacifier in the particular rhythmic fashion that has become one of the show's most recognizable visual signatures. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old since December 1989. She has been watching and processing and sitting in silence for 36 years. And in that time, the show has given us glimpses, carefully controlled glimpses, of what is behind the silence. The glimpses are always brief, always resolved before they become fully legible, always just enough to suggest depth without committing to its full dimensions. The scripts that were written and never produced were the ones that committed. There are several of them, and they span different periods of the show's production, which suggests that the writers came back to this territory repeatedly over the years, each time arriving at a version that was more developed than the last, and each time encountering the same fundamental obstacle. To fully render what is behind Maggie's silence would be to change the show, not in small ways, in structural ways. Because Maggie's silence is not incidental to The Simpsons. It is one of the load-bearing walls. The family functions partly because Maggie does not disrupt the dynamics that have organized it. If Maggie speaks, if Maggie reveals the scope of what she has understood and retained and concluded over years of silent observation, the family has to reorganize itself around a new and significantly more complicated reality. And The Simpsons, whatever it is willing to explore in pulled episodes that never air, is not willing to reorganize its family structure in ways that can't be undone by the next episode. The most developed of the Maggie scripts takes place over a single long night during a severe storm in Springfield. The kind of storm that takes out power and fills the house with the particular intimacy that darkness creates, where the usual spatial organization of rooms and schedules, and the boundaries between people who are used to moving around each other dissolve slightly, and people end up together in ways they wouldn't otherwise be. Homer and Marge are managing the practical challenges of the storm. Candles, the question of whether the basement is flooding, the radio reports about how long the power is expected to be out. Bart is treating the whole thing as an adventure. Lisa is reading by candlelight, which in a house without power means she has positioned herself next to a window and is reading by lightning, which is both completely Lisa and also slightly surreal. And Maggie is awake. Maggie has been awake, the script establishes, through a series of small visual details that the family doesn't notice. For quite a long time, she is awake in a way that is different from how babies are awake. She is not fussy or bored or in need of attention. She is simply present, fully present, with the kind of alert watchfulness that the script describes as having a different quality from her usual watchfulness, as though the storm has done something to the house that has made her more visible to herself or to whatever is watching her from the outside. The episode's central scene arrives around what the script indicates is 3 in the morning. The storm is at its peak. Everyone else in the house is eventually asleep, Marge having finally surrendered to exhaustion and Homer having been asleep for hours. Bart is out in the same way that children fall out of consciousness during excitement, fast and complete. Lisa is asleep over her book, and Maggie is in her crib, and she has been in her crib, and she is looking at the ceiling with a quality of attention that has nothing to do with the ceiling. The scene that follows is the one that the writers apparently found most difficult to write and most difficult to abandon when the decision was made not to proceed with the episode. Maggie climbs out of her crib. This is not unprecedented in the canonical show. Maggie's physical capabilities have always been inconsistently rendered, calibrated to the needs of whatever story is being told. But in this scene, the way she climbs out is different. It is deliberate and methodical, and she pauses at the top of the crib side and looks around the room with a deliberateness that is unmistakably strategic. She is checking whether anyone is watching. No one is. She climbs down. She goes first to Lisa's room, and she stands in the doorway and looks at her sister, who is asleep with the book still open in her lap, and the script describes what passes across Maggie's face in this moment as something between recognition and protectiveness. A much younger sibling recognizing in an older one something familiar, a quality of mind that the world around them is not designed to accommodate, a kind of loneliness that they share but have never been able to discuss. Then she goes to Bart's room, and she looks at Bart, and what registers on her face is something more complicated than what she felt looking at Lisa. Something that contains affection and frustration in equal measure, and also something like admiration for his absolute commitment to operating in exactly the mode the world expects of him, with no gap between performance and reality. Then she goes to her parents' room, and she stands at the foot of the bed where Homer and Marge are asleep, and she looks at them for a long time. This is the moment in the script where the writers were at their most careful. They were aware that what Maggie sees when she looks at her parents is information that the episode needs to contain without making explicit, because making it explicit would require the episode to articulate a conclusion that the show is not prepared to stand behind. What Maggie sees when she looks at Homer and Marge is simply her parents. People she loves with a depth and a completeness that her limited vocabulary has never been able to express. People who are doing their best with what they have been given, in a town that has been systematically designed to limit what they were given. People who love her back in ways they don't know how to show because nobody ever showed them. In a family that was broken before it began, in a loop that has been running for as long as any of them can remember. She looks at them for a long time. Then she goes back to her room. She climbs back into her crib with the same methodical deliberateness. She lies down. She puts her pacifier back in her mouth. She closes her eyes. In the morning, the storm has passed. The sun comes through the windows. The family wakes up and begins the usual business of morning, cereal, and school, and the complicated logistics of a household that has too much happening in too small a space. And Maggie is in her high chair, as she always is, watching, as she always does, with the same expression that she always has, and nobody knows that she was up in the night. Nobody knows what she saw, or what she concluded, or what she decided, in the hours when the storm was at its loudest, and the house was dark, and everyone else was asleep. Nobody thinks to ask. Babies don't do things like that. Babies don't go on tours of the house at 3 in the morning and stand at the feet of their parents' beds and look at them with eyes that understand too much. Babies don't. The show would like you to believe. Maggie does. Section 11. The last couch gag, the finale written for when the show actually ends. Every episode of The Simpsons begins the same way. The theme music plays, the title appears, the family rushes home from various locations around Springfield and converges on the couch in the living room, and what happens when they arrive at the couch is the couch gag, a brief visual joke that has been a structural feature of the show's opening since the very beginning. The couch gag has ranged from simple to elaborate, from a single image to full animated films by guest directors, from the absurdist to the genuinely moving. It has been used over the years as a space for the show to do things that the episode proper doesn't allow, to be strange, to be artistic, to be occasionally sad in a way that the rest of the episode isn't built around. There is a final couch gag. It has been written. It has been, according to people who know of its existence, animated. And it will play exactly once, at the beginning of the last episode of The Simpsons, whenever that episode airs. What it contains is, understandably, one of the most closely guarded secrets in the show's production history. But fragments of information about it have circulated over the years among people who work in the animation industry, and the picture assembled from those fragments suggests something that is, in the simplest possible description, the couch gag running backwards. Not in the literal sense of reversed footage, though there is apparently some of that, in the structural sense. The last couch gag, as described by the fragments that have circulated, begins where all the previous couch gags end, with the family on the couch. And then it undoes itself. The family gets up from the couch. They leave the living room. They move through the house in a way that is both familiar and off, as though the house is being remembered rather than occupied. They exit through the front door, and then they disperse, each of them going somewhere specific, somewhere that is referenced in the show's history but not described here, somewhere that represents, for each character, the particular and private version of home that their public version has always been protecting. And then the house is empty, and the couch is empty, and the television is on, showing something that no one is watching, and the camera stays on the living room for a moment, the light through the windows. The particular quality of a room that has been occupied for a long time and is now not occupied. The way things look when they have been organized around people and the people have left. And then the music resolves, and the episode title appears, and the last episode of The Simpsons begins. The people who know about this couch gag describe it as something that is very difficult to watch without feeling the full weight of 36 or 40 or however many years the show will have run by the time it airs. Not because it is designed to produce sadness in a manipulative way, but because it is designed to be honest, to acknowledge that the loop is ending. To let the empty house be what an empty house actually is, which is a record of the time that was spent in it, compressed into a single image. When the show ends, we'll see it. Until then, it waits. Section 12. Springfield After Dark, the adult episode that was destroyed. This is the one that gets talked about in whispers. In the late 90s, during a period when the show was at a creative crossroads, and its producers were beginning to grapple seriously with the question of what it meant for a primetime animated show to have been on the air for almost a decade, there was a proposal. The proposal came from within the writing staff, from a group of writers who had been working on the show long enough to feel constrained by its format and ambitious enough to want to find out what the show was capable of if some of those constraints were removed. The specific constraint they were interested in removing was the one imposed by the show's broadcast time slot, which was family programming territory, 8 o'clock on Sunday nights, the most family-friendly slot in the most family-friendly primetime period. The proposal was to make a version of a Simpsons episode that operated as though the broadcast constraints didn't exist. Not for broadcast, and in fact, everyone involved understood from the beginning that this would never be broadcast. This was not an attempt to make something that would eventually air with edits. This was an attempt to make something that simply answered the question, what does Springfield look like after the children are in bed and the adults are left to themselves and nobody is performing for a family audience? The episode was made. It is apparently the only episode in the show's history that was produced specifically with the understanding that it would never be broadcast, and therefore with complete freedom from the standards and practices review process that governs everything else the show has made. The voice cast recorded it. It was animated to broadcast quality. The people involved have described it as technically indistinguishable from a regular episode of the show in everything except content. The content is where it differs. The episode follows a single night in Springfield, beginning after midnight. The children of Springfield are asleep. The specific adults who are followed through this night are primarily the secondary characters, the people who exist in the background of the show's regular episodes and who are therefore, in the broadcast version, only ever seen through the filter of their public, daytime roles. Moe, at the bar after last call. Ned Flanders, alone in his house in the hours when nobody is watching him perform. Chief Wiggum, driving the empty streets in a patrol car at 3 in the morning. Edna Krabappel, in an apartment that the regular show has almost never shown us the inside of, living the specific and solitary life of a person who spends her days with other people's children and comes home to no one. The episode is not pornographic, despite what the word adult in its description might suggest. The people who have described it say that this is the first thing people get wrong when they hear about it. It is adult in the sense that it deals with adult subjects, adult loneliness, adult disappointment, the particular texture of lives that have not gone where they were supposed to go. It is quiet and slow and, by most accounts, genuinely heartbreaking in stretches. The specific scene most often mentioned by people who have seen it is the one involving Ned Flanders. The Ned of the regular show is relentlessly upbeat, relentlessly positive, a person whose surface presentation is so comprehensively cheerful that his depths are rendered invisible by the glare of his own goodwill. In the episode, Ned is alone in his house in the middle of the night, and he is not upbeat. He is sitting in his kitchen with a cup of coffee that has gone cold, and he is looking at the chair across the table, which is empty, which is the chair that Maud used to sit in, and he is talking to her. Not praying, not performing the ritual of grief. Just talking. The way you talk to someone who isn't there because the alternative is the complete silence of a house that was built to hold two people and now holds one. What Ned says in these circumstances is private in a way that no version of Ned in the regular show has ever been allowed to be. He says things about his faith that suggest a more complicated relationship with it than his public cheerfulness implies. He says things about Homer, his neighbor, which are neither the patient forbearance of the regular show's version of their relationship, nor the suppressed rage that emerges during Ned's breakdown episode, but something more honest than either, a kind of exhausted, affectionate bewilderment at the fact that this particular man, of all the men in the world, is the one who ended up being the most consistent presence in his life. He says things about being alone. The episode was made and then, apparently, the decision was made to ensure it could not accidentally enter circulation. The reason given, to the extent that a reason was given, was that the episode represented a version of the characters that the show had never authorized for public consumption, and that the characters, as public entities with defined relationships to their audience, had a kind of integrity that the episode violated. To see Ned Flanders crying in his kitchen at 3 a.m. talking to his dead wife was to receive more of Ned than the show had ever agreed to give you. And the show, having given that much, felt it owed it to the character and to the audience to ensure that the giving was controlled. The episode was not destroyed in any physical sense. It was archived with more security than most archived material. Whether anyone will ever see it is not clear. Whether anyone should see it is a genuinely interesting question, and the people who have seen it are divided on the answer. What is agreed on is that it exists, and that it is among the most honest things the show ever made, and that the Ned in it is more Ned than the Ned you know, more real, more present, more fully the person that the show has been protecting him from being. He was up late, talking to Maud. He was always up late, talking to Maud. The cameras just hadn't been on him before. Section 13. Marge leaves the episode. Exploring the marriage actually ending. The Simpson marriage is one of the foundational texts of American popular culture's understanding of what a marriage is and what it endures. Homer and Marge have been used, in the cultural conversation, as a reference point for the kind of relationship that survives everything, that absorbs tremendous amounts of dysfunction and mutual limitation, and still persists, held together by some combination of genuine love and the deep, specific familiarity of people who have spent most of their adult lives inside the same domestic orbit. The show has tested the marriage many times. The tests always resolve in the same direction. They come back together. They stay together. The marriage is one of the permanent features of Springfield's architecture. The episode we're discussing is the one that asked what the world looked like if it didn't resolve. The premise is not explosive. It doesn't involve infidelity, or a dramatic revelation, or an event that functions as an external catalyst for a decision that would otherwise not be made. It is, in fact, deliberately undramatic. The episode begins in the middle of an ordinary week, with an ordinary accumulation of small things. A dish that wasn't washed, a request that wasn't heard, a plan that was made and then unmade without consultation, a silence where something should have been said. The individual items are trivial. The pattern they form is not. Marge doesn't leave in anger. This is the thing that the writers were most careful about, and the thing that apparently made the episode the hardest to write. She doesn't leave because something happened. She leaves because she looked at the life she was living and recognized finally and clearly that the cost of maintaining it had become too high. Not too high in the sense of unbearable, in the sense that she had been bearing it so long and absorbing so much and organizing everything around the management of Homer's limitations and the children's needs and the household's endless demands that she had become, in some fundamental way, unavailable to herself. And she decided that she needed to find out whether the person she had been before all of this was still there. She needed to find out if there was still a Marge who existed when nobody was needing her. Homer's response in the episode is what the writers most wanted to get right, and what reportedly went through the most revisions, because the obvious comic version of Homer's response, the version that the show in its regular mode would have produced, was Homer panicking and doing something stupid and then doing something unexpectedly sweet, and the whole thing resolving in a way that confirmed the marriage's resilience? The writers didn't write that version. They wrote the version where Homer, without the usual comedy buffer, has to sit with the actual reality of his situation. And the reality is that Marge has been doing an enormous amount of work to sustain something that Homer has consistently failed to see as work. And the reasons for Homer's failure to see it are complicated. And some of them are his fault, and some of them are the fault of the circumstances he was born into and the damage done to him by those circumstances. And none of this makes the failure acceptable from Marge's point of view. And Homer has to hold all of that simultaneously without collapsing it into either self-justification or self-destruction. There is a scene in the episode where Homer is alone in the house, with the children at school and Marge staying with a friend, and he attempts to do the things that Marge does. He attempts to manage the household for a single day. And what the episode does with this premise is not use it as a source of comedy. The writers were apparently very firm about this. No jokes about Homer's domestic incompetence. Just Homer, genuinely attempting to understand the scope of what he has been failing to see, encountering it through the simple, exhausting, continuous work of a day spent keeping a household functional, and failing at some of it, and succeeding at some of it, and arriving by the end of the day at a quieter and more specific understanding of what was actually at stake. The episode does not end with reconciliation. The writers felt that a reconciliation ending would be dishonest, would undercut everything the episode had been building toward. It ends with Homer calling Marge and saying something that the script specifies only as the true thing, leaving what the true thing is for the actors and the audience to find, and Marge listening, and neither of them saying anything else for a long time. And the call eventually ending with no resolution stated and no promise made, and both of them sitting in different spaces with the full uncertainty of what comes next. The ending is not a breakup. It is an acknowledgement. Two people who have been performing their roles in a long marriage arriving simultaneously at the recognition that the performance has been covering something that they haven't looked at directly in a very long time, and the episode leaving them there, in the uncertainty, without rescuing them from it. The network did not want this episode. The audience, they argued, invested in the marriage, needed the reassurance that came with reconciliation. A Simpsons episode that ended with the marriage in genuine suspension was a Simpsons episode that failed to provide the emotional resolution that was the implicit contract of 30-odd years of Sunday nights. The writers argued back that the implicit contract was exactly what the episode was examining. That doing the same thing every time a problem arose, having the problem resolve in the same way, was itself a symptom of something. But the argument was lost, as these arguments at this level tend to be lost, because the show's continuity required the marriage to be intact for the next episode and the episode after that, and every episode until the last one. The marriage survived. Marge came home. The episode that asked whether she would was filed with the others, in the room where the questions that don't get answered are stored. Section 14. The town remembers the episode where Springfield breaks its amnesia. There is a version of Springfield that remembers everything. In the show's regular run, Springfield's amnesia is one of its defining characteristics. The town forgets. Episodes reset. Events that should have altered the town permanently are simply not present in the next episode, as though the intervening time has not only passed, but has actively undone itself, leaving no trace that anything extraordinary occurred. This is, as we have discussed at length, both a practical feature of episodic television and something more interesting than that, something that the show has used deliberately and with intelligence to comment on the specific kind of selective memory that communities deploy to maintain comfortable versions of their own histories. But the writers have always known what they were doing with the amnesia, and at some point in the show's run, a group of them decided to write the episode where it stops. The episode where Springfield, for reasons that the script carefully develops, finds itself unable to perform the usual forgetting. Where the memories that should have been suppressed by the social contract and the chronic cognitive damage and the comfortable self-deception that has always been Springfield's primary psychological defense are simply, all at once, available, where the town wakes up and finds that it can see. The trigger for this in the episode is mundane in the way that the most important triggers in The Simpsons are always mundane. A routine maintenance check at the plant inadvertently shuts off a particular system that has been running so long that nobody at the plant is entirely sure what it does or in fact that it exists. The system, it transpires, has been doing several things simultaneously. It has been managing a specific kind of atmospheric emission that has, over the decades of its operation, had effects on the neurological function of everyone in Springfield. Effects that are specifically suppressive. The town's remarkable capacity for forgetting has never been entirely organic. It has been maintained partly by something in the air. Something that burns in the early years of the plant's operation, identified as a useful byproduct, and quietly worked to preserve rather than remediate. When the system goes offline, Springfield begins to remember. The episode follows this process over the course of a single day, and the specificity with which the writers tracked what each character remembers is one of the things that makes the episode, by all accounts, both extraordinary and impossible to broadcast. Because what the characters remember is not the small personal grievances and embarrassments that the show usually deploys as the content of recalled moments. What they remember is the actual history of Springfield, the things that happened and were immediately and collectively forgotten, the disasters and revelations and exposures that the town has been resetting over and over for decades. Homer remembers every near miss at the plant, every moment of catastrophic failure that somehow didn't become catastrophic. Every day he arrived at work and found things in states that should have prompted emergency protocols, and instead prompted another donut. The memories arrive in sequence, and they are not abstract. They are specific and sensory and vivid in the way that suppressed memories, when they return, tend to be vivid. He sits in the kitchen with his cereal going soggy and he can't move because the weight of what he is remembering is too much to stand up under. Marge remembers every time she looked at the water coming out of the tap and noticed something, some quality that wasn't quite right, and filed it in the category of things she chose not to examine, because examining them would have meant acting on what she found, and acting on what she found would have required a chain of decisions that she didn't have the resources to make. The accumulation of those moments, laid out in sequence, is a record of what it costs to be a person who is responsible for a household in an environment that is actively hostile to health. Every choice to not look, every decision to trust that things were probably fine, every morning of cereal and school lunches produced from a kitchen connected to pipes, connected to water that had been in the ground near the plant. The children remember. What Bart and Lisa remember is, in some ways, the most affecting part of the episode, because children process suppression differently from adults, and what has been suppressed in Bart and Lisa is not specific incidents, but something more like a sense, a background awareness that things are not as they should be, that the town they live in has a quality that other places don't have, that the specific texture of their daily experience contains something that should have a name but never does. When that suppression lifts, what they feel first is not horror, it is recognition. The sense of finally being able to name something that has been nameless for as long as they can remember. The relief of being able to stop working so hard to not know what they know. The episode's second act is Springfield in Chaos. Not the comic chaos of the show's regular episodes, which is energetic and loud and resolves into comedy. A quieter chaos. The chaos of people trying to talk to each other about things that the community's social contract has always prevented them from talking about. Neighbors stopping each other on the street and saying, "Do you remember? Do you remember the fish? Do you remember the dome? Do you remember the times the cooling towers made?" Sounds that cooling towers aren't supposed to make. And we all went back inside and didn't say anything to anyone. Do you remember all of it? The third act is the town hall meeting. Every major character is there. And the meeting is not the usual Springfield town hall, where problems are loudly discussed and solutions are loudly proposed, and nothing is ultimately resolved, because resolution would require changing something that the system is designed to prevent changing. This meeting is different. The people in this meeting have memories now, and they are trying to decide what to do with them. The decision they reach is the heart of the episode, and it is the reason the episode was never broadcast. Because the decision is not to do nothing. It is not to forget again, or to paper over the memories with comfort, or to subordinate the truth to the economic necessity represented by the plant and its owner. The decision, reached by Springfield, is to act, to hold something to account, to look directly at what the town has been avoiding looking at and to make a demand based on what they see. The episode doesn't depict what comes after this decision. It ends at the moment of its making. Springfield gathered in the town hall, deciding together to stop forgetting and start requiring. This was too much. Not because it was unrealistic, not because it was dramatically incoherent, because it was too hopeful in a specific way, a way that implied that the systems the show had spent 36 years depicting as immovable were in fact movable, if the people inside them were ever fully awake at the same time. And The Simpsons, whose entire structural premise depends on those systems being immovable, could not broadcast an episode that suggested otherwise and then go back to normal the following Sunday. The system went back online in the episode's final scene. The memories began to fade. Springfield returned by degrees to its usual quality of comfortable not knowing. The meeting was forgotten. The decision was forgotten. The memories of everything they had been about to do dissolved back into the pleasanter fog. But the episode itself remembers. It's in the room. It will always be in the room, and the people who made it know it's there. Section 15. The loop stays open what it means that these episodes exist. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We have walked through production rooms where things were made that the world was never meant to see. We have looked at episodes that were completed and shelved, scripts that were written and filed, scenes that were recorded and then locked away in archival storage, where the temperature is controlled and the tapes or files are maintained with the kind of care that you give to things you believe still matter even if you've decided they can't be used. We have met versions of characters we thought we knew that are fuller and stranger and sadder than the broadcast versions. Versions that were put back in their boxes not because they were bad, but because they were too much, too real, too present, too honest about things that American television has always had complicated reasons for not being honest about. And now it's late, and the streets outside are quiet, and whatever room you're in is probably dark or close to it. And The Simpsons is playing somewhere on a television in a way that has become so ambient, so constant, so thoroughly woven into the texture of American domestic life, that you can probably remember the specific sound of the couch gag music, the way you can remember the sound of a parent's voice, or the particular smell of a house you grew up in. What does it mean that these episodes exist? It means the show's writers were telling the truth about something. Not the full truth, not in the broadcast version, never the full truth there, because the broadcast version has always operated inside a set of constraints that prevented the full truth from being sustainable as weekly family entertainment. But in the pulled episodes, in the ones that went too far or said too much or arrived at a version of the characters and the town that was too real to be contained by the usual comic architecture, the writers were getting at something genuine, something about what it means to live inside a system that is organized at every level around preventing you from seeing it clearly. Something about the specific texture of working-class American life, which is not the cartoonishly broad satire of a typical primetime comedy, but is something more particular and more painful, the experience of loving a life that you also understand, in your clearer moments, is not the life you were capable of living. Something about families which are not the warm, chaos-managed, conflict-resolving units that television prefers them to be, but are instead the places where the specific damage of each generation is passed on to the next, sometimes transformed and sometimes not, always present. Homer's stupidity is not funny. It is the end result of a long chain of things that were done to him and to the generations before him, and the show has always known this, and the pulled episodes are the place where it was most willing to say so directly. Lisa's intelligence is not a gift in the uncomplicated sense. It is a quality that makes her world simultaneously more and less bearable, depending on the day and the circumstances, and the degree to which she has been able to maintain whatever distance is necessary to keep functioning inside a town that is not built for her. And the pulled episodes are the place where the show looked at Lisa's experience without the softening effect of comedy and sat with what it saw. Marge's patience is not a character trait. It is the performance of a person who has made the calculation over and over across decades that the alternative to patience is something she is not prepared to set in motion, something whose consequences she cannot fully predict and does not want to risk. And the pulled episodes are the place where the show asked what it would cost Marge to stop performing. Burns's villainy is not theatrical. It is the logical extension of a specific set of values, a specific understanding of what people are for and what they are worth, that is not unusual or aberrant, but is in fact deeply embedded in the structures of American capitalism and has been embedded there since before Burns was born into the money that made him what he is. And the pulled episode where he sat in a deposition room and said yes, he knew, is the place where the show allowed the full weight of that understanding to be felt, rather than deflected by the safety of comic distance. Maggie's silence is not a developmental stage. It is a strategy. And the pulled episodes are the place where the show followed that strategy to its logical end and stood in the room with whatever it found there. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has been a comedy for 36 years. And the comedy has done real things in the world, has made people feel seen and understood and less alone in their own domestic lives, has used the frame of absurdist satire to say things about American culture that needed to be said and that were heard by hundreds of millions of people who might not have heard them in a different form. The comedy matters. The 788 episodes that aired matter. The show, as it exists and has always existed in the public record, is one of the most significant pieces of American culture produced in the last 100 years. But the episodes in the archive room matter too. They matter because they are the evidence that the people who made the show understood, on some level, what the show was actually about. That beneath the comedy, beneath the couch gag and the Springfield chalkboard, and the recurring jokes about donuts and strangling, and the specific quality of Bart's contempt for authority, and Lisa's grief at the gap between the world as it is and the world as she believes it should be, there was always a story being told about something real. About power and damage and love and the specific heroism of ordinary people trying to maintain something decent inside a system that makes decency structurally inconvenient. About the way families hold together and fall apart and hold together again without ever fully understanding what it is they're holding and why they keep reaching for it. About the fact that Springfield, which looks like a cartoon and sounds like a cartoon and is in every technical sense a cartoon, is not different enough from the actual world to be comfortable about. The pulled episodes are the receipts. They are the documentation that the show was always capable of going further than it went, and that the reason it didn't go further was not inability but choice, specifically the choice of an entertainment industry that depends on its audience remaining comfortable enough to keep watching. They are the proof that somewhere between the first episode and the last, the writers found the real story, the one that exists beneath the jokes, and wrote it down, and put it in a room where it has been waiting ever since. Waiting for what, exactly, is a question that might have a different answer depending on how long the show runs and how the archive is eventually handled, and whether the people who currently control access to these materials will at some point decide that the distance between the making and the moment is large enough to make release possible. Some of these episodes may eventually surface. Some of them may remain sealed indefinitely. Some of them may have already been described so thoroughly in the private circulation of production history that the practical distinction between being in the archive and being in the world has narrowed to almost nothing. But for now, most of them are in the room. Most of them are waiting. The darker versions of the characters we love are in there, sitting in the dark, in the temperature-controlled quiet, being whoever they are when the cameras that have always been on them are finally off. Homer is in there. Homer who is afraid. Homer who understands more than he can hold. Homer sitting on someone's front steps in the dark, trying to stay awake to his own life for just a few minutes longer. Marge is in there. Marge who is tired. Marge who sat with the full weight of what her patience costs and decided, just once, to put it down. Marge in an empty kitchen in someone else's house, trying to remember what she wanted before wanting, got complicated by everything that needing it brought. Lisa is in there, writing in a document that nobody else will read, with the rain on the window and her saxophone across the room, being honest about her day in a way that the public version of herself has never quite been able to sustain. Bart is in there, standing outside the house at 3 a.m, with the gas wearing off and the ordinary world reassembling itself around him, holding on to the clarity for one more second, before the morning takes it. Maggie is in there, standing at the foot of her parents' bed in the storm-dark house, looking at them with everything she knows and everything she has concluded and everything she loves, distilled into a single expression that the cameras would have to stay on for a very long time to read completely. And Burns is in there, in the deposition room, the lights overhead making him look smaller than he usually does, saying yes, he knew. He always knew. They are all in the room where the archive lives, in their truer versions, waiting in the dark. And tonight, with the hour late and the streets quiet, and the television somewhere in the background playing the show that everybody knows, you can almost feel them there. The Springfield that the show built and never showed, the family that the writers found and put away, the town that remembered and then, by the episode's end, forgot again. The loop is still running. Springfield is still yellow and airborne and impossible, still balanced on the edge of things that should have consequences and don't. Still built around a cracked reactor and a billionaire who won't die, and a family that never ages, and a town that never changes, and a mystery that never quite resolves. The show is still on. The couch is still there, the theme music still plays, and somewhere in an archive room, on tapes or drives or in whatever format the material has survived in, the darker and truer and more honest Springfield is also still there. Waiting, quiet, patient in the way that true things tend to be patient, because true things don't need to be anywhere in particular. They just need to exist. And existence, in Springfield, has always been the one thing that can't be taken away, even from the things that were never supposed to air, even from the stories that went too far. Even from the episodes that looked too clearly at something too real and had to be put away before the audience could see what the writers had seen. Even from Homer, dreaming in his hospital bed, constructing a Springfield perfect enough to live in forever. Even from Maggie, watching everything, saying nothing, waiting. Especially from Maggie. The loop stays open. Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. That's the whole point. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If any of this has stayed with you, or if you have your own theories about what's in the archive room, the comment section is there, and the people who found their way here in the middle of the night are exactly the right people to talk to about this. Sleep well. The show will still be running in the morning. It always is. Extended section. The writers who knew a deeper history of what almost aired. Every television show that runs long enough develops a kind of institutional memory that is separate from and stranger than its public record. The episodes that aired are the official version, but the people who made those episodes carry inside them another version, the version made of all the things that were written and discarded, all the conversations that happened in writers' rooms at 2 a.m. when everyone was tired and the usual defenses were down, and someone said something that was too true to put in a script, but too true to entirely forget. Either. The institutional memory of The Simpsons is enormous. 36 years of rooms full of very smart people trying to figure out what this show was capable of saying, pushing against the limits of what it was allowed to say, and occasionally, in the moments we've been discussing tonight, going past those limits and producing something that had to be retrieved. The writers who worked on The Simpsons during its golden period, the years roughly spanning seasons 3 through 8, have spoken in various public contexts about the specific creative environment of those years. And one of the things they return to consistently is the sense that the show had not yet fully understood what it was, which sounds like a weakness but was actually the source of its greatest strengths. A show that doesn't fully understand itself is a show that is still capable of genuine surprise, that can reach around its own corners and find things it didn't expect to find. The Simpsons in those years was reaching constantly. Not everything it found was usable. Some of what it found was too dark, too unresolved, too politically specific, too emotionally raw for the format it had been assigned to occupy. But the reaching itself produced a quality in the work that has never been entirely replicated in the later seasons, when the show had come to understand itself more thoroughly and had also come to understand the limits of what it was permitted to say. The writers who were present during those years describe a creative culture in which the question, "Can we actually do this?" had a different quality than it has in most television writing rooms. In most rooms, the question is primarily logistical. Can we afford to do this? Do we have the technical capacity to do this? Will the network standards department pass this? In the Simpsons room during those years, the question had an additional dimension that was harder to define. It was something more like, is this true enough to say? Is this something we actually understand well enough to put in the mouth of a character that millions of people trust and love? Is this the version of the story that respects what the show has built? And these were harder questions, and they produced harder conversations, and occasionally they produced the conclusion that something true was true in a way that the show couldn't currently sustain, and it went into the pile of things that were true but couldn't be used. Some writers stayed at the show for years. Some of them left after a few seasons, taking with them their particular memories of what had been attempted and what had been pulled back. Some of them have written about the experience in books and essays and interviews, and reading those accounts with the specific question of the archive in mind, looking for the places where a writer describes something that sounds like it was almost said, something that was approached and then retreated from, you find a record of the show's ongoing negotiation with itself about how honest it was prepared to be. There is a particular quality to the way veteran Simpsons writers talk about the show's relationship to its darker material. They tend to describe it not as suppression but as stewardship. They were taking care of something. The show, at its best, had a relationship with its audience that was genuinely rare in American television, a relationship based on a specific kind of trust, the trust that the show would use its access to 30 million households per week to say things that were worth hearing. That trust was built slowly, over years, by episodes that earned it. And part of maintaining it was understanding that the trust had limits, that there were ways of being honest that would break the relationship rather than deepen it, not because the audience couldn't handle honesty, but because the format of entertainment has specific emotional expectations built into it, and violating those expectations, however truthfully, is a different act from honest storytelling. It's a kind of ambush. The pulled episodes are the ones where the writers got close enough to the line to see it clearly and then either crossed it before they realized, or crossed it intentionally in the service of a project that they understood would never reach the public, or crossed it with the hope that the network would accept something further than it had accepted before and discovered that hope was wrong. Each episode in the archive is a different version of this story. What connects them is the quality of their ambition. These are not the pulled episodes of a show that was struggling creatively and occasionally overcorrecting. They are the pulled episodes of a show that was, at its best, trying to do something genuinely difficult and occasionally succeeding at it and having to live with the consequences of that success. The Burns deposition episode succeeded at making Burns real. The Maggie Storm Night episode succeeded at making Maggie's inner life legible. The Homer breakdown episode succeeded at making Homer's damage comprehensible as damage rather than comedy. And each success was also a removal from the broadcast record, because the show's relationship with its audience was built on a version of these characters that could be sustained over decades, and the truest versions of these characters could not be sustained that way. There is a theory, not widely discussed but present in the conversation among people who study the show seriously, that the archive is not a failure condition, that it is in fact the show's most important ongoing project, that the real Simpsons, the one that matters most to the people who made it, is not the 788 broadcast episodes but the entirety of the work, including the work that never aired. That the show's significance in American culture is not fully visible in what was broadcast, but is only fully visible when you include the pulled material, the rejected scripts, the scenes that were cut, the directions that were explored and then abandoned. That the show's relationship to the truth about American life is a relationship that includes the moments when the truth was too much for the format, as well as the moments when the format was capacious enough to hold it. If this theory is right, then the archive room is not where the failures live. It is where the most honest work lives. And the show's legacy, seen whole, is not just the comedy that 30 million people watched on Sunday nights for 36 years. It is also the document of what those people were watching and the gaps between the jokes. The portrait of Springfield that was always being assembled, piece by piece, in the rooms where the writers worked and the archive where the truest episodes waited. The show that was never supposed to air, playing in the dark, to an audience of everyone who ever wondered why something about this cartoon felt like it was about more than a cartoon. Extended section. The characters who were almost different alternative versions and abandoned arcs. Parallel to the pulled episodes and sometimes overlapping with them is the record of the show's abandoned character arcs. The paths that were considered and begun and then closed off, leaving the characters on the trajectories they are on now rather than the ones that were also possible. These alternatives are important because they illuminate the choices that were made. and choices are only visible in contrast to what was not chosen. Bart Simpson was almost different in ways that would have fundamentally altered the show's center of gravity. In the early seasons, when the show was still feeling out what each character was actually for, there were extended conversations among the writers about whether Bart's trajectory should be allowed to develop in the direction that his established characteristics logically implied. Bart is smart, in the specific way that people who have no patience for convention are smart. He has an instinctive understanding of how systems work and how they can be subverted. He has charisma and tactical intelligence, and a quality of attention that is usually entirely devoted to mischief, but that, the writers could see even in the early seasons, was capable of being redirected towards something larger. There were scripts in which Bart begins, slowly and without drama, to grow up. Not to stop being Bart, but to begin the process of becoming the kind of person that a Bart, given time and space, might become. Someone formidable. Someone whose relationship with authority is not just defiance but a genuinely thought-through critique of authority's actual claims. These arcs were never developed beyond early drafts, because the show's structure required Bart to remain 10 years old, and Bart remaining 10 years old meant that his development had to remain in a permanent state of near beginning. But the drafts exist, and the version of Bart they describe is one that the writers were apparently very interested in. A Bart who has been watching Springfield his whole life with the same quality of attention he brings to everything, and who has been quietly assembling from what he's observed an understanding of the town that is, in its own way, as comprehensive as Lisa's. Different in kind, because Bart's understanding is tactical where Lisa's is analytical, but not less complete. The abandoned Bart arcs connect to something the show has always maintained as a background presence, but never foregrounded. Bart and Lisa are not opposites. They are complementary. They have been given, by their particular genetic and environmental inheritance, two different but equally powerful relationships to the truth about Springfield. Lisa can articulate the truth. Bart can act on it. The show has kept them in opposition, using their differences as a source of sibling friction and comic contrast, but the pulled material suggests that the writers were at least sometimes interested in what happened when they worked together rather than against each other. A Simpsons in which Bart and Lisa pooled their respective capabilities would have been a different show, and probably a shorter one, because the specific combination of analytical clarity and practical action that they represent together is not easily contained by the usual mechanisms Springfield deploys to prevent exactly this combination from operating. The abandoned arcs for Marge are, in many ways, the most extensive. The broadcast Marge is a specific and carefully maintained character, patient and loving and occasionally showing the cracks in her patience in ways that produce comedy or pathos, but always resolve back to the baseline. She is the show's structural anchor. The abandoned arcs suggest that the writers were consistently aware of how much was being compressed into that anchor function, how much of Marge's actual complexity was being organized around the maintenance of the family at the expense of the character's own life. There are early drafts of what might have been multi-episode arcs in which Marge pursues something, specifically something that is for her rather than for the family, and what happens to the family structure when the person who has been holding it together directs some of that holding energy toward herself. These arcs were abandoned not because the writers lost interest, but because the show's format didn't permit sustained character development across multiple episodes in the way that would have been necessary to do them. Justice. Marge returning to school, which the show has touched on in various single-episode formats, was apparently a multi-episode arc in early conception that would have taken Marge through the specific experience of a middle-aged woman in an academic environment, encountering ideas and people and possibilities that her domestic life has not provided, and having to decide what to do with the encounter. The version that would have aired was reportedly rich and specific and very good, and it was condensed into a single episode that retained the premise but could not retain the development. Grandpa's arcs are among the most poignant of the abandoned material, partly because the broadcast show has always underused the character, and partly because the abandoned material suggests a depth that the broadcast show has only occasionally touched. Grandpa Simpson carries more of the show's history than any other character. He is a direct connection to the 20th century in its full sweep, from the Depression, through the war, through the decades of American industrial expansion that built and then began to hollow out places like Springfield. The abandoned material in which Grandpa is given time to carry this history fully, to tell it in the specific and digressive and sometimes unreliable way that old people tell history, is something that the writers came back to repeatedly. It was always too slow for the format. It required sustained attention to a peripheral character in ways that the show's pace didn't accommodate. But the draft suggests that what Grandpa knows and what he was capable of saying was considerable. He was there before Burns was running the town. He remembers Springfield before the plant. He has a picture of what the place was like when it was possible to see it for what it actually was, before the contamination and the cognitive suppression and the decades of organized forgetting had had their full effect. And he has watched his son and his grandchildren and the town itself, and he has understood what was happening to them in ways that he has never quite been able to communicate. The pulled material suggests that there were scripts where he tried, where Grandpa tried to tell Homer what he knew, where he sat across from his son and attempted to hand him the history that Homer was too damaged to fully receive. The attempts failed, in these scripts. Not dramatically. They just ran into the wall of Homer's limitations, the specific cognitive barrier that prevents him from making the connections that would make his own life legible to him. And Grandpa, who understood this wall and why it was there, and who put it there, went back to the retirement home and sat in his chair and watched his stories on television and didn't try again. The abandoned arcs for Burns are the ones that would have most changed the show's meaning if they had been developed. Because Burns, as the show's primary antagonist, carries the weight of everything the show has to say about concentrated power and its effects. In the broadcast version, he carries this weight through theatrical villainy, through the specific pleasure of a caricature of evil so exaggerated that it functions as a safety valve, allowing the show to say true things about corporate power while maintaining enough comic distance to prevent the audience from having to fully absorb the implications. The abandoned arcs are the ones in which the comic distance is reduced, where Burns is allowed to be old in a way that is not funny, where his extraordinary age and the treatments that have sustained it are treated as what they actually are, the logical endpoint of a specific philosophy about what wealth is for. Burns has spent a century and more ensuring his own survival at whatever cost to others that survival requires. The abandoned arcs are the ones that trace this project across its full timeline and asked what it produces in a man, in the long run. What it is to have outlived everyone who ever knew you as young. What it is to have accumulated so much history that the present is only intelligible as the latest increment of a pattern you began so long ago that its origins are beyond memory. The Burns who emerges from these arcs is not a simpler or more sympathetic character than the broadcast version. He is a more complete one. A man whose cruelty is not theatrical but structural, built into the logic of a project that has been running for so long it no longer requires deliberate maintenance. He is what happens when a certain kind of self-interest operates without check or challenge for long enough to become indistinguishable from natural law. And the town of Springfield, breathing his emissions and drinking his runoff and sending their children to schools that are underfunded because of his appetites, is what happens to a community when natural law has been defined by someone who will outlive everyone making complaints about it. This is not a comfortable thing to put in a cartoon about a yellow family on Sunday nights. It is, however, what the show has always been pointing at. The abandoned arcs are the pointing without the comedy to soften it. Extended section. The night Springfield was real personal histories and the show's effect. There is something that happens to people who grew up watching The Simpsons that is different from what happens to people who grew up watching other shows. And it is worth spending some time with this difference, particularly in the context of what we've been discussing tonight, about the episodes that never aired and the truths they were reaching toward. What The Simpsons did, over the decades of its run, was provide a shared language for a specific experience of American life that had not previously had a language of this kind. The experience of being a working-class or lower-middle-class family in an ordinary American town in the late 20th and early 21st century, with all the specific texture that this entails, the particular combination of genuine love and spectacular dysfunction that characterizes households under continuous economic stress, the way that public institutions that are supposed to help you, schools and hospitals and municipal government, turn out to be organized around interests that are not exactly yours, the way that the people in charge of the things that affect your life most directly are reliably either incompetent or corrupt or both, The way that this produces in ordinary people, not just cynicism, but a specific kind of exhausted dark humor that is the primary emotional register of survival in these circumstances. The Simpsons named this experience. It did so in a format that was accessible and funny and produced none of the guilt or discomfort associated with consuming something explicitly political. And in naming it, it gave the people living inside it something that is genuinely rare and genuinely valuable, which is the sense of being seen, of turning on the television and encountering something that said, without sentimentality or condescension, yes, this is what it is like, we know what it is like, and here is what it looks like from the outside, which is closer to comedy than to tragedy, and here is how you find that funny in a way that acknowledges the pain rather than denying it. This is what the 788 broadcast episodes accomplished, and it is not nothing. It is, in fact, enormously significant, and it is the reason that the show is beloved in the specific way that it is beloved, not just as entertainment, but as something more intimate than that, as something that was present during years that mattered. But the episodes in the archive are the evidence that the show was always capable of more than naming, that it was capable of examining, of asking why the experience it was naming existed and what maintained it, and whether it was necessary or whether it was the product of specific choices made by specific people in specific positions of power over long periods of time, and whether those choices could be different, and what it would take for the people living inside the experience to see it clearly enough to make demands about it. The broadcast show got as close to this as the format and the network and the economics of primetime entertainment would allow. The archive holds the versions that got closer, the versions that asked the harder questions, the versions that refused the safety of comic distance and sat with the full weight of what they were looking at, and the people who grew up with the show, who used it as a language for their own experience, who found in it a specific kind of recognition. Those people would, I think, be the ideal audience for the archive material, because they already know the characters. They already know Springfield. They have already done the work of investing in this particular fictional world and its particular fictional family, and they have earned, in some sense, the right to the fuller version, the version that the show was always working toward and only occasionally reaching. The archive is the gift that the show's creators couldn't give publicly. It is the thing they made for themselves and for the show, and perhaps, on some level, for the audience that had been patient enough and attentive enough and loving enough to follow the show this far. The audience that was, in a very real sense, ready for what the archive contains. Whether the archive is ever opened is not something any of us can know tonight. Whether the fuller versions of these characters are ever released into the world is a decision that belongs to the people who control the rights and the estate and the brand, and those people have excellent reasons, financial and legal and practical, to be cautious about it. The Simpsons as a property is worth billions of dollars, and the specific value of that property is tied to the specific image of the characters that has been constructed and maintained over decades of careful management. The archive material complicates that image. That is part of its value and part of the reason it has been kept where it is. But knowing it exists is something. Having a sense of what it contains is something. Sitting with the knowledge that the show you loved was made by people who were trying, in the moments when everything else fell away, to tell you something true, that is something you can carry. Homer is still at the plant. Marge is still at the stove. Bart is still 10 years old, planning whatever is going to happen on Saturday. Lisa is still at her window with her saxophone, working through something in the music that she can't quite say any other way. Maggie is still in her high chair, watching, not saying anything. The loop is still running. Springfield is still there. And in the archive, the darker and truer and more honest versions of all of them are still there too, waiting in the temperature-controlled dark, being exactly who they are when no one is supposed to be watching. You've been watching, now go to sleep. The show will still be running when you wake up. The sound design of Springfield, what you hear, and what it means. One of the things that gets lost in any written account of The Simpsons, including this one, is the sound. The show has an audio landscape that is as specifically constructed as its visual one, and the relationship between what you hear in Springfield and what you understand about Springfield is more complex than it first appears. The music, composed by Alf Clausen for the bulk of the show's run, is a full orchestral score, and it does something that television scores rarely do, which is operate as a genuine interpretive layer on top of the visual and dramatic content, sometimes confirming what you're seeing and sometimes, very quietly and very deliberately, contradicting it. The pulled episodes were scored too, in most cases. The music that was written for them has, in some instances, been described by people who were present during recording sessions as the most interesting work the composers did on the show, precisely because the episodes themselves were pushing against the show's usual tonal register and the music had to push with them. The cozy domestic comedy underscore that the show deploys in its regular episodes, the warm strings and the rolling bassoons and the particular quality of musical whimsy that has become one of the show's most recognizable signatures, was not appropriate for all of the pulled material. The composers had to find other registers, quieter ones, more ambiguous ones. Music that could hold sadness without resolving it into sentiment, music that could accompany a scene of genuine horror without tipping into parody, music that could sit inside a long silence without rushing to fill it. The score for the Burns deposition episode is, by the accounts of people who heard it, among the most remarkable things the show ever produced musically. The deposition scenes are scored almost entirely for solo piano, very spare and very deliberate, with long intervals between notes that the piano lets sustain past the point of comfort before resolving or not resolving. It is nothing like the show's usual music. It sounds more like the kind of contemporary classical composition that the show might satirize in an episode about Lisa attending a pretentious concert. In the context of Burns describing, precisely and without evasion, the choices he made and the suffering they produced, the music creates a quality that one person described as the sound of something being counted carefully and found to be exactly as large as you already knew it was. The Maggie Storm episode's score is different again. It uses, according to accounts, a children's music box theme that has been allowed to run slightly slower than its normal tempo, just barely perceptibly slower, in a way that produces unease without drama. The theme is the kind of melody you associate with lullabies and nurseries, and the specific quality of tenderness that adults project onto infants, and the slowing of it, the deliberate dragging of its pace until what sounds comforting at normal speed sounds like something else entirely at this tempo, is a piece of musical storytelling that works entirely through the gap between expectation and delivery. You hear the music, and you expect to feel comforted, and instead you feel something that is harder to name. Something in the neighborhood of recognition and disquiet. The scored version of the Homer Breakdown episode is said to have used, at key moments, complete silence. Not pauses in the scoring, but extended passages with no music at all, allowing the ambient sounds of the Simpson house, the refrigerator hum, the sound of the street through the window, the particular quality of quiet in a suburban house in the middle of a weekday, to carry the full weight of the scene. This is not a technique American network television uses, because ambient silence in a scene without music puts the audience in direct contact with the emotion of the moment without the buffer of a score, and most television audiences, and most network executives, are not comfortable with this degree of directness. The Simpsons has always used its music as one of its primary mechanisms for managing audience emotion, for making things funnier when they need to be funnier, and more moving when they need to be more moving. And a scored episode that deliberately removed this mechanism for extended stretches was doing something that the show's format was not designed to accommodate. And yet the people who were present for the mixing sessions described the result as extraordinarily effective. The silence made Homer real in a way that the usual orchestral accompaniment would have prevented. When Homer sat on his front steps at the end of the episode, in silence, trying to hold on to his own clarity, the absence of music was the most honest thing the episode did. Because the lives of people like Homer are not accompanied by music that tells you how to feel about them. They are accompanied by the ambient sounds of ordinary houses and ordinary streets, and the feelings you have about them, if you have them at all, have to be assembled from that ambiguity without the assistance of an orchestral cue telling you whether to be sad or hopeful or somewhere in between. The sound design of the pulled episodes is, in this way, its own document of what the show was reaching toward. The choices made in the scoring and the sound design of these episodes were choices made in the service of a truth that the broadcast episodes were not always equipped to serve. And those choices are part of what makes the archive material, for the people who have encountered it, feel different from the broadcast show. Not better necessarily because the broadcast show is genuinely good and the score is genuinely good, but more present. More willing to ask the audience to do the work that the work requires. Expansion section. Springfield's geography at night. What the town looks like when everyone is asleep. There is a specific quality of stillness that small towns have at 3 in the morning, and The Simpsons has captured this quality in its best episodes with a precision that is one of its less discussed achievements. The show is usually understood as a daytime or early evening show, organized around the rhythms of work and school and the particular density of activity that family life generates during the hours when everyone is awake and in motion. But there are moments in the show's run, scattered across its decades, where the camera has been allowed to sit with Springfield in its off hours, in the dark and the quiet, and what it finds in those moments is something that the daytime Springfield, with its constant noise and motion and incident, doesn't have room for. The Springfield of 3 in the morning is a place where the specific architectural choices of an impossible geography are most visible, because the people who would normally be in front of those architectural choices, mediating them with their activity and their noise, are absent. The nuclear power plant, which in the daytime episodes is always a backdrop to something else, a source of industrial hum and occasional emergency, becomes at night something more elemental. It is lit from inside and outside, and the light it casts across the surrounding area is a specific color, not quite the natural yellow of conventional lighting, something slightly off, something that suggests the light is coming through material that has absorbed it partially before letting it pass. The river near the plant, which is the river where Blinky lives, has a quality at night that the show usually avoids depicting directly. At night, with nobody standing at its banks looking at it, it is simply what it is, and what it is not entirely a natural waterway anymore. The residential streets of Springfield at night have a quality that the show's best animators have sometimes been allowed to render in full. The houses on Evergreen Terrace in the dark, with the specific way that suburban houses hold the darkness differently depending on how many people are inside them and how deeply they are sleeping, is a kind of landscape that is familiar to anyone who has ever been awake in a neighborhood after midnight and noticed how different everything looks when the social performance of daytime has been suspended. The Simpson house from the outside, at night, is a house where the light in the upstairs windows was on later than the other houses and is now off, and the dark that has replaced it is a domestic dark. The dark of people who have gone to sleep carrying whatever they carried through the day, which is more than they usually get credit for carrying, and which the darkness holds as carefully as the daylight does but with less pretense about what it is. The pulled episode that depicted Springfield's night, the one about the adults while the children sleep, was interested in this landscape in a specific way. The nighttime Springfield it depicted was not the Springfield of horror or of supernatural threat. It was the Springfield of ordinary exhaustion, of people at the end of their ordinary days, doing the things they do when nobody is watching, and the performance of daily life has finally been suspended. Mo at the bar after the last customer leaves, sitting in the specific silence of a place that has been full of people and is now empty, doing the small administrative tasks of ending a business day with a thoroughness that suggests this is the part of his work he likes best, the part where the bar is his again, and not a venue for everyone else's noise and need. The specific movements of a man who has organized a large part of his life around a space and knows every inch of that space with the particular intimacy that comes from years of daily presence. Ned Flanders' house at night, as described earlier, is a house where the lights stay on later than the other houses on the street. And the light in Ned's house at night is a specific kind of light, the light of someone who is not yet ready to be alone with the darkness. Who needs the presence of light the way some people need the presence of sound when they are in spaces that have become too quiet? The house is clean and organized, with the same thoroughness that Ned brings to everything, and the cleanliness and organization are genuinely beautiful in the way that care for domestic space is always beautiful, but they are also a record of the energy that goes into maintaining things that could deteriorate. And at night, in the quiet, that maintenance effort is visible in a way that the daytime, with its constant activity, conceals. Chief Wiggum in his patrol car is the Springfield of official authority at night, and what the pulled episode did with this image was something specific and somewhat surprising. Wiggum in the daytime episodes is a comic figure, a bumbling representative of institutional incompetence who produces comedy through his combination of laziness and stupidity and fundamental good humor about his own inadequacy. Wiggum at night, in the patrol car, driving empty streets, is something slightly different. He is a man doing a job that is mostly boring and occasionally frightening, in a town that has more going on beneath its surface than it acknowledges in public, and he is doing it with a kind of stolid steadiness that the daytime comedy version of him doesn't really capture. He knows the streets, he knows which houses have lights on past midnight, and what those lights usually mean. He knows the specific geography of Springfield's difficulty and trouble, the places where things happen that don't get reported, the corners of the town where the official record and the actual record diverge, and he navigates this geography every night with a combination of the particular competence that comes from long familiarity and the particular willingness to not look too hard at certain things that comes from being a public official in a town that has powerful interests invested in certain things. Not being looked at. The pulled episode used this quality of Wiggum's nighttime experience not for comedy but for something closer to pathos. He is not a bad man. He is a man in a system that makes certain kinds of badness easy and certain kinds of goodness very difficult, and he has made his accommodations with this system over the years. And at 3 a.m, in the quiet of the patrol car, he has the specific awareness of someone who has thought about those accommodations more than he usually lets himself think about them, and has arrived at a kind of peace with them that is neither complacency nor shame, but something more complicated than either. The geography of Springfield at night, in other words, is the geography of Springfield as it actually is, stripped of the daytime performance of normality that everyone maintains in their public lives. And the pulled material that used this geography was using it as honest cartographers use landscapes to reveal what is actually there rather than what the official maps show. The show's animators, in the segments of the pulled material that have been described by people who saw them, apparently took the nighttime Springfield seriously as a visual project. The color palette was different from the daytime show, pulling toward blues and grays and the specific amber of sodium vapor streetlights, and the rendering of the power plant in particular was done with an attention to atmospheric detail that the daytime episodes, with their brighter palettes and busier visuals, had never deployed. The plant at night, in these sequences, is not a cartoon nuclear facility with comic steam venting and safety violations played for laughs. It is a structure that has been operating continuously for decades, and the specific quality of its continuous operation is visible in the nighttime light, in the way that the warmth coming off it has become part of the microclimate of the surrounding area, in the particular quality of the air around it that the plants and animals in its immediate vicinity have adapted to, that the people in its immediate vicinity have also adapted to, whether they know it or not. This is what the nighttime Springfield of the pulled material was reaching toward, the town as it is when the daily performance of normality has been suspended. The town as it has actually been for all the years the show has been depicting it, behind the jokes and the comedy and the warm domesticity of the broadcast version. The town at night being exactly what it is, expansion section, the episodes about Springfield's children, a generation that will never grow up. Among the most extensive categories of pulled and altered material in the show's production history is the material dealing with Springfield's children, by which we mean not just the Simpson children, but the full population of Springfield Elementary, the children who move through the show's background as a kind of permanent representation of what the future of this town looks like. These are children who have been in the 4th grade or the 2nd grade for 36 years. They have been sitting in Bart's and Lisa's classrooms, walking the halls of Springfield Elementary, playing in the schoolyard with the same equipment that was there on the first day, being educated by the same teachers who were educating them on the show's debut episode, in a school that has been chronically underfunded for the entirety of its depicted history. The pulled material about these children is distinct from the pulled material about the Simpson children specifically because it is dealing with a somewhat different question. The Simpson children are the protagonists, the characters the show has invested in, and the characters the audience has a relationship with. The background children of Springfield are something else. They are the generation that will inherit Springfield as it is, and the question of what that inheritance actually means is one that the show has rarely examined directly, because examining it directly would require acknowledging some things about what Springfield has done to its children that the show is generally not prepared to say out loud. The most developed of the pulled episodes about Springfield's children was written as an ensemble piece, following a large group of children from Springfield Elementary through a single school day without the organizing presence of the Simpson family to anchor the story. This was, in itself, an unusual structural choice for the show. The show is not an ensemble in the way that some other long-running animated series are. It is built around the Simpsons family and uses the larger Springfield population primarily in relation to that family. Pulling the family out of the story and following the background children directly was a formal experiment that the writers were apparently very excited about and that the network was very uncertain about. The children the episode follows are a specific and carefully chosen selection of the background population of Springfield Elementary. There is a child from a family that the show has depicted in various episodes as being at the lower end of Springfield's economic spectrum, a family that has been in the background of several scenes involving poverty, living in the part of Springfield that is downstream of the plant, and that has the water quality issues that being downstream of the plant for several decades tends to produce. The episode follows this child through a day at school with a specificity about what his life actually looks like, what his daily experience contains, that the show's regular format has never permitted for a background character. He has noticed things that the adults around him have trained themselves not to notice. He is 9 years old and he already understands. In the way that children who grow up in difficult circumstances tend to understand things, that the world he is living in is organized in ways that are not designed to produce outcomes that are good for him specifically. He does not have a language for this understanding yet. But the understanding is there, expressed in the way he moves through the school day, in the specific quality of his attention to the world around him. There is a girl from a family that has the particular kind of stability that comes from managing within very narrow margins for a very long time, a stability that looks from the outside like ordinariness, but is actually the product of continuous, exhausting effort. She is bright and organized, and she uses these qualities specifically in the service of not attracting attention, because attracting attention, in her experience, is usually the precursor to something going wrong. She moves through the school day with an efficiency that, in a more forgiving context, would be recognized as a form of intelligence, an adaptation to circumstances that demands constant management. In Springfield, it is simply what she does. Nobody has thought to notice it as anything in particular. The episode follows these children and several others through their ordinary school day, and what it builds, in the accumulation of ordinary details, is a portrait of a generation of children who are learning, through the specific curriculum of daily experience in Springfield, what the world is and what their place in it is. And what they are learning, the episode suggests, is not entirely different from what their parents learned in the same school, in the same building, under the shadow of the same plant. The loop is being maintained not just through the cognitive damage that the radiation theory proposes, but through the more ordinary mechanism of children growing up in circumstances that model specific expectations about what life contains and what can be asked of it. The school itself, in the pulled episode, is rendered with a specificity that the broadcast show has never quite achieved. The building is old and its age is visible in ways that the show usually treats as background detail. The water fountains produce water that the children have learned to drink quickly and without tasting, which is something that children learn to do without instruction in environments where the water has a quality they don't want to think about. The windows in the oldest part of the building are original windows, single-paned, drafty in winter, and the classroom temperatures in the winter months are the temperatures of rooms that are being inadequately heated by a system that was designed for a building of this size, but has not been maintained at the level required to keep it functioning at full capacity. The teachers know this and have adapted to it, and the children know this and have adapted to it, and the adaptation has become invisible through repetition, which is one of the things that repetition does to discomfort. Principal Skinner, in the pulled episode, is seen in a way that the show rarely allows. Not as the comic figure of authority who is both pompous and pathetic, not as the imposter revealed by the episode that bears his false name, but as a man who has been running this school for a long time and who understands, with a clarity that the daily demands of administration usually prevent him from dwelling on, that the resources available to him are not sufficient to give these children what they need. He has been working within these constraints for so long that they have become the definition of normal, and what is possible within the constraints has become the definition of success. He makes the best of what he has. The pulled episode followed him through a day in which he was asked to make the best of less than what he usually had, a minor budget cut that by the standards of the school's actual needs was trivial, but that by the standards of what the school was already lacking was significant. And he managed it. He absorbed it. He made the adjustments and moved on, because that is what you do when you have been making adjustments for this long. The episode ends with the children going home. The specific quality of the afternoon light in Springfield in the fall, which is the kind of afternoon light that has a particular poignancy regardless of context, the light that says the day is ending, and the work of the day is dissolving into the ordinary evening, and the ordinary evening into the ordinary night, and then the ordinary morning and the day again. The children go home through this light, and what the episode does with this image is hold it. Hold it for long enough that it becomes something other than background detail. Long enough that the children going home through the specific quality of Springfield's contaminated afternoon light become a statement about what is being handed down in this town, what is being passed from one generation to the next through the ordinary mechanisms of the ordinary day. The network found the episode too slow and too structural, too interested in background characters who the audience had no established relationship with, to be appropriate for the show's format. There was a note about the episode's lack of a clear comedic through-line, which was accurate. There was a note about the absence of the Simpson family as an organizing presence, which was also accurate. There was not a note about the episode being too honest about what growing up in a town like Springfield actually does to the children who grow up in it, but that was, by the accounts of the writers who were present for the review conversation, the thing that was most present in the room without being named. The episode is in the archive with the others. The children in it are still in the 4th grade. They are still in the 2nd grade. They are still walking through the afternoon light on the way home from Springfield Elementary, through air that has a quality that air should not have, in a town that has organized itself around not asking why. Expansion section? The writer's room at 2 a.m. What gets said when everyone is tired. Any account of the pulled episodes of The Simpsons is incomplete without some account of the environment that produced them, which is the writer's room in the late hours of a long production day, when everyone present has been there for 12 or 14 hours, and the usual defenses are down and the jokes are coming less easily, and what comes instead is something more unfiltered and more honest than what the show usually permits. Television writing rooms have a specific ecology that is difficult to describe to people who haven't been in one, and the ecology of The Simpsons room at its peak was specific in ways that produced the particular quality of the show's best material. The room was staffed by people who were, by most measures, very smart. But the intelligence of the room was not the pure academic intelligence of people who have spent their careers in institutions designed for the exchange of ideas. It was the intelligence of people who had come to television writing from specific and often difficult backgrounds, who had grown up in places like Springfield or adjacent to places like Springfield, who carried inside them a direct experiential knowledge of the economic and social conditions the show was depicting, and who were using that knowledge every day in the service of a product that was, ostensibly, a comedy. Late in the production day, the comedy was often harder to find. The jokes that had seemed obvious in the morning light looked flatter by midnight. The premises that had been developed through the day had taken on, in the course of development, a weight that the initial high-concept pitch hadn't anticipated. A story about Homer losing his job, which begins as a simple comic premise, becomes, by the time the writers have been working on it for 8 hours, a story about what it means to be a person whose sense of worth is tied to a job that has always been inadequate to produce worth. And the comedy that the story generates at this point is a different kind of comedy than the comedy that was in the room at 9 in the morning. It is the comedy that exists alongside something heavier, the comedy that is aware of the heavier thing and is choosing to be comedy in spite of it, or sometimes because of it. It is in these late-night sessions that the pulled material most often originated. Someone in the room would push a premise past the point where the comedy could contain it, and what would emerge on the other side of the comedy was something that the room would sit with for a while before deciding what to do with it. Sometimes the decision was to pull back, to find the comic register again and use that as the episode. Sometimes the decision was to keep going, to see how far the premise would take them if they followed it without the usual comedy safety net. And occasionally, the following produced something that the room recognized as genuinely good and genuinely unmakeable for broadcast. And those sessions produced the drafts that eventually ended up in the archive. The late-night quality of those sessions is something that the writers who were present in them return to when they talk about the work they are most proud of and most ambivalent about. There is a specific kind of honesty that becomes available at 2 in the morning in a room full of exhausted people who have been building something together all day. The social performances that govern ordinary professional interaction have been worn down by fatigue. The competitive dynamics that shape writers' room culture during the daytime are quieter at 2 in the morning because everyone is too tired to be territorial. And what emerges in that space is sometimes remarkable. The specific quality of thought that comes from a group of people who are too tired to be careful and who are, as a result, saying things that the careful daytime version of themselves would have managed differently. The writers who worked on the Burns deposition episode have described the genesis of that episode as a late-night conversation that had moved past the immediate creative task of the day and into something more philosophical. Someone had been talking about a news story, a real story about corporate liability and environmental contamination and the specific way that very large legal settlements are structured to avoid establishing legal precedents. And the conversation had moved from the news story to the show's own territory, to Burns and the plant, and what a legal accounting of Burns's choices over the decades of the plant's operation would actually produce if it were pursued honestly and completely. And someone had said, what if we just wrote that? What if we just sat Burns down and asked him the questions that the show has never asked, and let him answer them in the way that the character, as fully realized, would actually answer them? Not to produce comedy, just to see what it sounded like. The session that followed, by all accounts, was one of those late-night moments that people who were present remember with a specific clarity. The room was quiet, people were tired, and the questions were being asked, and the answers were being drafted with a carefulness and a directness that the usual production process, with its deadlines and its comedy requirements and its network oversight, would not have permitted. What emerged from that session was the core of the deposition episode, Burns's account of his own choices, rendered with a precision and an absence of comic deflation that made it feel, in the context of the show's history, like something entirely new. The episode was good and the episode was not usable. Both of these things were understood in the room at the same time, and the specific combination of the goodness and the unusability is part of what has made the episode the thing it is in the memories of the people who were present. They made something true, and they knew, even as they were making it, that the truth they were making was more than the show could currently hold. And they made it anyway, because that is what you do at 2 in the morning when the defenses are down and the work is real, and you are tired enough to be honest. The archive is full of things made in that spirit. Full of the work that happened in the gaps between the show as it was allowed to be and the show as the people making it understood it could be. The gap between those two things is not a failure gap. It is an aspiration gap. And the material that lives in it is the most honest evidence the show has produced of what the people who made it were actually trying to do. Expansion section. The audience that watched and the audience that would have watched. There is something worth spending time with, before we close, about the relationship between the show and its audience, and specifically about the question of what the audience would have done with the pulled episodes if they had aired. This is a counterfactual, obviously. We can't know, but it is an interesting counterfactual because the show's relationship with its audience has always been more complex and more sophisticated than the network's management of that relationship has generally assumed. The Simpsons audience, at the show's peak, was the largest single audience in American primetime television. 30 million people or more, gathering around televisions on Sunday nights, which in the show's early years was still something that happened simultaneously, a shared national experience in real time. That audience was not a uniform group. It was a demographic mixture that spanned age ranges and educational backgrounds and economic situations and geographic regions in ways that few primetime shows have managed before or since. Part of the show's genius in those years was its ability to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, to be funny to a 10-year-old for reasons that were completely different from the reasons it was funny to the 10-year-old's parents, who were themselves receiving a different layer of the same material. The pulled episodes, most of them, would have been understood differently by different parts of this audience. The Burns deposition episode, for instance, would have landed differently for a viewer who had direct experience of corporate environmental contamination, who had grown up in a town with a facility like the plant, who had the specific and personal knowledge of what it feels like to live downstream of something that has been hurting you for decades, then it would have landed for a viewer whose relationship to corporate power was more abstract. Both viewings would have been legitimate. Both would have been the show doing what the show does, which is reach across the gap between people who share a country but not necessarily a set of experiences and find the common ground. The Marge episode, the one where she leaves, would have been received differently by the viewer who has been inside a marriage that cost something in the specific way that Marge's marriage cost something than by the viewer who has been inside a marriage that didn't, or who hasn't been inside a marriage at all. The show has always been able to sustain this range of reception. Its comedy is general enough, its emotional intelligence specific enough, that it consistently finds purchase across a very wide range of personal experience. The reason the pulled episodes were pulled was not, in most cases, that the audience couldn't have handled them. The reason they were pulled is that the institutions responsible for producing and broadcasting them, the network and the production company and the show's management structure, made a series of decisions about what the audience was prepared to receive, and those decisions were conservative in ways that the audience's actual capacity may not have required. Television has always been more cautious than its audience about how much truth the audience can sustain, and this caution has always been driven partly by the economics of mass entertainment, which require not just a large audience but a comfortable audience, an audience whose relationship with the programming is relaxed enough that it continues to be receptive to the advertising that pays for the programming. The pulled episodes were, in most cases, not comfortable. They were honest. And honesty in the context of mass entertainment has always been understood as a risk that requires management. The archive is the result of that management. But the management was always a bet about the audience's capacity, a bet that 30 million people could not sustain, over the course of a standard Sunday night time slot, the level of honesty that the Burns deposition episode required, or the level of sadness that the Marge episode required, or the level of clarity about what growing up in Springfield actually costs that the children episode required. And that bet may have been wrong. The audience for The Simpsons, at its peak and across its run, has demonstrated a consistent willingness to receive material that is more emotionally and intellectually demanding than the network's management of the show has usually assumed. The episodes that are most beloved are frequently the ones that took the most risks, that pushed the hardest against the format's usual limits, that were most willing to be sad or strange or honest in ways that the average episode of a primetime animated comedy is not. The pulled episodes pushed harder than the broadcast episodes. They were more willing to sustain the discomfort. They arrived at places that the broadcast episodes approached and then retreated from. And the bet that they would have broken something in the audience's relationship with the show, rather than deepening it, is a bet that was never tested, because the episodes were never aired. We will never know, now, whether the bet was right. What we know is that the episodes exist, that the writers made them, that the composers scored them, and the animators animated them, and the actors recorded their lines, and the whole machinery of a television production was brought to bear on the creation of these things that were then put away. That the show's creators believed, at the moment of making them, that these episodes represented something the show needed to say, and that the distance between that belief and the broadcast record is the space where the archive lives. The archive is the show's shadow. Every long-running work of art has one. The parts that were cut, the versions that were abandoned, the directions that were explored and then closed off. Most shadows are simply the evidence of the process of making something, the necessary waste of a creative endeavor. But some shadows are different. Some shadows are the evidence that the thing that was made was always capable of being more than it was allowed to be. That the forces which shaped it were shaping it in specific ways, towards specific ends, and that what was held back not because it was inferior, but because it was too much of the thing the show actually was, and the machinery of mass entertainment requires a certain distance from too much. The Simpsons is a show that has been held back from itself for 36 years. The archive is the evidence. The pulled episodes are the shape of what the show knew and couldn't quite say. The score and the animation and the voice performances are the form of truths that the broadcast version has been circling for decades, approaching and retreating, in the specific rhythm of a show that is trying to say something that the format it is in was not quite built to hold. It held quite a lot anyway. The archive held the rest. Both of them are The Simpsons. Both of them are Springfield. Both of them are the same yellow family on the same green couch in the same impossible town, living the same loop that started in 1989 and has been running every Sunday night since. The difference is that the archive version is awake. The archive version knows what time it is. The archive version is standing at the foot of the bed in the dark, looking at what it loves, knowing everything, choosing silence for now, waiting for the moment that is its own and nobody else's. Waiting. Still waiting. Somewhere in a temperature-controlled room in a building that doesn't have a glamorous name. The truest Springfield is in there, waiting for you. Expansion section. The long sleep why these stories are for the dark. We tell certain kinds of stories in the dark that we wouldn't tell in the daylight, and this is not an accident. The dark changes the relationship between the story and the listener in specific ways that have been understood by storytellers for as long as storytelling has existed. In the dark, the usual visual distractions are absent. The boundary between the listener's interior world and the world of the story becomes more permeable. The defenses that the daylight maintains, the constant visual processing, the awareness of other people and their reactions, the social performance of being a person in a world with other people in it, are relaxed in the dark, and what enters in their place is something quieter and more internal. A state of receptivity that is closer to dreaming than to waking, and that makes certain kinds of truth available that the waking, defended, daylight self is not always willing to receive. The Simpsons itself has always understood something about this. The show airs at 8 o'clock on Sunday nights, which is the specific liminal moment when the week is ending and the new week is gathering itself to begin, and the family is together in the dark of the living room with the television's light playing across their faces. And something about this setting has always been part of what the show is. Not just the content, but the context. The watching of it in the specific darkness of a family evening is part of the experience the show was designed for. The pulled episodes, the ones we've been visiting tonight, were designed for a similar darkness but a darker darkness, a later hour. The children in bed, the house quiet, the kind of night where the things you've been holding at arm's length during the day are closer, and the defenses that usually manage the distance between you and the things you know, but don't always let yourself know are thinner. These episodes are for the hours when Springfield feels real, when Homer's damage feels recognizable rather than comic, when Marge's patience feels expensive rather than reassuring, when Lisa's loneliness feels close rather than observed from a comfortable narrative distance, when Burns's accountability feels necessary rather than hypothetical, when the loop that nobody in Springfield can see clearly enough to break feels less like a cartoon convention and more like something you've seen before, in your own life, in your own town, in the specific way that certain things keep happening because the system they happen inside was designed to make them keep happening. The dark is where these things are available, and the late hour, the hour when sleep is close and the boundary between waking and dreaming is permeable, is when the Springfield of the archive is most present. Not the yellow Springfield of Sunday nights. Not the Springfield of couch gags and Homer strangling Bart and the familiar warmth of a family that survives everything it goes through. The other Springfield. The one in the archive. The one that knows. You've been there tonight. In the dark, in the quiet, with the stories that were made and put away, with Homer in his deposition, Burns in his, with Marge standing at the door of someone else's house, deciding, with Lisa writing honestly in the dark, with Maggie at the foot of the bed, choosing her silence for reasons that are her own. The loop is still running. Springfield is still there. And if you drift toward sleep now, with all of this present, you might find that the Springfield you meet in that space is the truer one, the one that the archive holds. The one that knows what the power plant has done to the water, and remembers, and chose to remember anyway. The one where the characters are who they are when the camera is off, and the comedy is suspended, and the day is done, and it is just them, in the dark, being whatever they actually are. Sleep well. The show will still be running when you wake up. It always is. The archive will still be there too. And the truest Springfield, the one that exists in the gaps between 788 episodes, in the spaces between the jokes, and behind the couch gag and underneath the reset button, is still waiting for the moment it is finally allowed to be what it is. It has been waiting for 36 years. It is patient. It knows how to wait. After all, time doesn't move in Springfield the way it moves anywhere else. And in the dark, In the archive, in the stories that were made and not shown, it moves least of all. The architecture of what was hidden, a section-by-section examination of each episode's production history. What follows is a more granular account of the production circumstances surrounding each major category of pulled material. These are the details that circulate in the specific subculture of people who care deeply about The Simpsons as a creative and cultural artifact. The researchers and archivists and obsessive fans and former crew members whose combined testimony forms the closest thing we have to a public record of what exists in the archive room and how it got there. On the Burns death episode, the episode in which Burns dies was developed over the course of several months, which is unusually long for a Simpsons episode. The normal production timeline for the show moves from initial pitch to finished episode in a period measured in weeks, not months. The extended development on this particular episode reflects the genuine difficulty the writers experienced in getting the premise to behave. A premise about Burns dying is, in the abstract, a simple and obvious one for a show that has spent decades building a character whose primary function has been to represent the unchecked accumulation of wealth and power at the expense of the community around him. The death of such a character should, in narrative logic, represent some kind of accounting, some moment where the system he has constructed has to confront the fact of his absence and determine whether it can continue without him. What the writers found in the months of development was that this accounting was far more complicated than the premise suggested. The death of Burns does not produce liberation in Springfield. It produces vertigo. Because the system Burns built was not designed to produce a condition in which his death liberates anyone. It was designed to produce a condition in which his death simply transfers the vertigo of dependence from one configuration to another. The town doesn't know how to exist without the organizing principle of Burns's ownership of the plant and the economy around it. The workers at the plant don't know who they work for now. The politicians Burns has been buying for decades don't know who will buy them next. The people who have been organizing their resentment around Burns as a target suddenly find themselves without a target, which is a specific and disorienting kind of loss. The writers spent a long time in the development process trying to find the comedy in this situation, because the show is a comedy and the situation needed to be funny, and they could find comedy in it. The confusion and the disorganization and the specific absurdity of a town that has been structured around opposing a single person suddenly having no one to oppose, all of this was available as comedy material. But underneath the comedy, the writers kept finding something that wasn't comic, which was the question of whether Springfield could actually survive the departure of the thing that had been making it sick. Whether the damage was so thoroughly incorporated into the town's structure that removing the source of the damage would not produce recovery but collapse. This is not an unfamiliar problem in the real world. Economies built around single industries, single employers, single sources of power and money and employment have a specific relationship with the harm that those industries produce. The harm is real. The harm is ongoing. The harm is documented and acknowledged and mourned. And the continued operation of the industry is also necessary, in the specific and terrible sense that the economic lives of the people who live around it depend on its operation continuing. The mine keeps running even though the mine is killing the miners, because the mine stopping running would mean the miners' children had nothing to eat. The plant keeps leaking even though the plant is poisoning the water, because the plant is also the only significant employer in a town where there are no other significant employers. The accounting that should happen, the full and honest reckoning with the harm that has been done, is permanently deferred by the necessity that the harm continue to be produced, because the harm is produced by the same mechanism that keeps the community alive. The Burns death episode was reaching toward this specific and genuine dilemma, and reaching toward it in the context of a character and a community that the audience had spent years caring about. And the combination of the genuine dilemma and the genuine caring was too much for the comedy to hold. The episode was pulled. Burns came back without explanation. The dilemma went into the archive. On the Treehouse segment. The pulled Treehouse segment was developed in the context of a production period when the show was actively experimenting with what the horror anthology format of the Halloween specials could accommodate. The writers in this period were aware that the Treehouse episodes had developed their own conventions, their own set of expectations, and they were interested in testing whether the format could sustain something that violated those conventions. The convention they were most interested in violating was the one that said, The horror of a treehouse episode was always externalized, always a monster or a threat that came from outside the characters' ordinary lives and therefore could be bracketed off from the show's regular emotional register. The segment they developed internalized the horror. It made the horror the same thing as the recognition, the moment of seeing the world as it actually is. And in doing so, it produced something that the writers were very excited about, and that was, from a formal standpoint, genuinely innovative. The horror of recognition format is one of the most powerful tools in the genre's repertoire, and deploying it through the mechanism of children seeing their own town clearly for the first time was a specific and intelligent use of that format. The problem was that the intelligence of the use was visible. You could see, watching the segment, that it was doing something deliberate and meaningful, that it was not just a piece of Halloween entertainment, but a piece of commentary about the show's own premise. And commentary about the show's own premise, in the context of a Halloween anthology, is not what audiences tuned into the Treehouse episodes to receive. They tuned in to have fun. The segment was not fun. It was genuinely disturbing, in the specific way that true things can be disturbing when you encounter them in a context that has not prepared you to receive them. The network's review of the segment focused on this quality of preparedness. The audience, the review concluded, was not prepared to receive this particular truth in the context of a Halloween special. The segment was cut and replaced with something more conventionally entertaining. The children went back to being unable to see Springfield clearly. The ordinary fog of perception reasserted itself, and the segment went into the archive. On the Named Names episode, the episode in which the show's writers named real corporations by name in the context of a story about environmental contamination represents one of the most explicitly political things the show ever attempted, and understanding its production history requires understanding something about the political context of the period in which it was made. The writers were producing the episode at a moment when the public conversation about corporate environmental liability was significantly more active than it has been in most other periods of the show's run. There had been a series of high-profile cases, covered extensively in national media, in which communities near industrial facilities had organized and litigated against the corporations responsible for contaminating their environments. These cases had produced settlements, some of them substantial, and they had also produced a public discourse about corporate accountability that was more specific and more detailed than the usual background noise of environmental politics. The writers had been following this discourse closely. Several of them had personal connections to it, family or community connections to places that had experienced the specific form of damage the discourse was addressing, and they wanted to write an episode that was honest about the specificity, that used the show's enormous platform to say something particular and precise rather than something general and safely vague. The episode they wrote was, in their view, well within the bounds of legitimate satire and accurate journalism. The corporations they named were corporations that had been named in public legal proceedings. The specific harms they depicted were harms that had been established in those proceedings. They were not making things up. They were putting on the television screen, in a form accessible to 30 million households, information that was already public but that had not been presented to this particular audience in this particular form. The legal department's concern was not about accuracy. It was about liability in a different sense, the liability of association. The Simpsons, as a brand, as a property, had a specific relationship with its audience and its advertisers that was worth an enormous amount of money, and that was maintained partly through the show's general refusal to be directly confrontational with the specific economic interests of the corporations that advertised during its broadcasts. Naming corporations by name in the context of a story about environmental damage was not just political speech. It was a potential disruption of the commercial relationship that kept the show on the air. The writers were told that the names had to come out. The names came out. The episode that aired retained the premise in its broad strokes but was purged of the specificity that had made it meaningful. It became a story about a fictional corporation doing fictional harm in a fictional town, which is what the show is always doing, and in doing so it rejoined the long tradition of satire that is safe because it is general, that is comfortable because it has maintained the crucial distance between the target and the truth. The original script, with the names, is in the archive. On the Homer Breakdown episode, The episode in which Homer's psychological state is examined directly was developed through an unusual process that began with the show's engagement with a consultant from the clinical psychology community. The show had periodically worked with consultants on episodes dealing with specific technical subjects, medical questions, legal questions, scientific questions. This was the first time, to the knowledge of people involved in the production, that the show had brought in a psychological consultant specifically to review a major character's established behavioral pattern and provide a clinical context for what the character was experiencing. The consultant worked with the writers over several weeks, reviewing the canonical record of Homer's behavior in the way that a clinician might review the history of a patient. What they found in this review was a pattern that was internally coherent in ways that the show had not necessarily planned for. The individual choices made over the years about how Homer would behave in specific situations, when added together, produced a portrait that was recognizable to someone with clinical training as the portrait of a person with specific and significant psychological needs that had been chronically unmet. The portrait was not a diagnosis in the clinical sense, but it was the kind of picture that a clinical framework illuminates in ways that a purely narrative framework does not. The writers found this illumination both exciting and uncomfortable. It was exciting because it suggested that the show had been doing something more coherent and more serious than its comedy register implied. It was uncomfortable because the coherence pointed toward a version of Homer that was harder to laugh at and harder to use as the primary engine of a Sunday night comedy than the version the show had been presenting. The Homer that the clinical framework illuminated was a person whose humor and resilience and fundamental lovability were not characteristics that floated free of his history and his circumstances, but were, in fact, the specific adaptations that those history and circumstances had produced. He was funny in the specific way that people are funny when humor is the best available tool for managing pain that they have no other mechanism to address. He was resilient in the specific way that people are resilient when they have no choice but to be. He was lovable in the specific way that people who have been deprived of love early in life become lovable, which is with a desperate, comprehensive eagerness to give and receive warmth that makes them both wonderful and heartbreaking. The episode that emerged from this process was, by the accounts of the writers who worked on it, the truest thing they had ever written about Homer, and it was not broadcastable, for the reasons that have been described. It remained in the writer's room in draft form for a period, revisited occasionally, its scenes quoted in conversations about the character, before eventually being moved to the archive along with the other material that was true and unmakeable. On the Springfield Massacre episode, the episode about a shooting in Springfield occupies a unique position in the archive because it is the only major piece of pulled material whose suppression was publicly acknowledged and publicly explained at the time. Every other episode discussed in this account exists in the territory of incomplete records and partial testimonies. This one is documented. The production company issued a statement. The cast acknowledged it. The circumstances of its pulling were reported in the entertainment press. This makes it, in some ways, the least mysterious of the pulled episodes and, in other ways, the most significant. Because the public acknowledgement of its existence and the public explanation for its suppression forced a conversation that the other pulled episodes have never had to have. The conversation about the relationship between the show and its responsibility to the real world. Most of the other pulled episodes were pulled because they were too much for the format, too honest for the broadcast context, too politically specific or too emotionally demanding or too formally experimental. This one was pulled because of something that happened outside the show entirely, because of an event in the real world that made the timing impossible and the subject matter too close. The acknowledgement of the pulling was, in a specific sense, also an acknowledgement that the episode existed and had value. If it had been without value, it would simply have been replaced and not mentioned. The fact that the production company said, "This is a good episode and we are not going to air it because the circumstances do not permit," was itself a statement about what the episode was and what it was attempting. It was, implicitly, a statement that the show was capable of producing material that was serious and responsible and thoughtful about the real world, and that the decision not to air it was a decision about timing and context rather than quality. Whether the episode will ever be seen is, as of this writing, unknown. The production company has not said definitively either way. The cast members who have spoken about it have said that they hope it will eventually find an audience in some form. The writers who made it have said it represents some of their most important work. The episode is waiting, as the others wait, for a context that will permit it to be what it is. Deep expansion. The voice performances, nobody heard what the actors gave to the archive. The performances recorded for the pulled episodes represent a specific and significant category of material that is rarely discussed in accounts of the archive, perhaps because it is less tangible than the scripts or the animation. But the voice performances are their own kind of evidence. They are the record of what the actors understood about these characters and what they were capable of communicating, in the specific context of material that was asking more of them than the broadcast episodes usually required. Dan Castellaneta, who voices Homer, has been doing this for 36 years. He has developed a relationship with the character that is in some ways more intimate than any other relationship with a fictional character that exists in American culture. He knows Homer. Not just the surface of Homer, the exclamations and the catches and the particular vocal quality of Homer's enthusiasm and pain. He knows the interior of Homer, the thing the voice is expressing when Homer is expressing something. And in the pulled episodes, particularly in the Homer breakdown episode and the moments where Homer has to hold complexity without the usual comic deflation, the accounts of people who were present in the recording studio describe performances that were unlike anything Castellaneta had done in the broadcast run. The specific quality that people who were present describe is the quality of quietness. The broadcast Homer has a specific relationship with volume. His emotions are expressed through volume, through the escalation of the voice to express escalating feeling. The pulled material required him to be quiet, to express things in the register of stillness rather than escalation. And the stillness, in Castellaneta's hands, was apparently extraordinary. The Homer of the deposition episode, the Homer of the front steps in the evening, the Homer visiting Burns as he dies, was quiet in a way that the broadcast Homer never is, and the quietness was not absence. It was presence. It was the sound of someone being entirely in a moment without the usual comic mechanisms for managing the difficulty of the moment. Julie Kavner, who voices Marge, has always been the performer most capable of finding the emotional depth beneath the show's comedy. The specific quality of Marge's voice, the huskiness that Kavner has always deployed with enormous precision, has always carried something in it that the comedy is only barely containing. The pulled Marge episodes, the one where she leaves and the aftermath episodes that were developed around that premise, gave Kavner the opportunity to let whatever she had been containing come fully to the surface. The accounts of the recording sessions for these episodes describe an atmosphere in the booth that was different from the usual recording atmosphere. The usual atmosphere is professional and efficient and often funny, because the show is funny and the people making it are funny, and the recording process reflects this. The Marge sessions for the pulled material were quieter, more careful. Kavner was doing something that required a different kind of concentration, and the booth was organized around giving her the space to do it. Harry Shearer, who voices Burns and Smithers among many other characters, is an actor with a particularly complex relationship to the pulled material because he was also publicly critical of some of the show's creative decisions during the period when some of the most significant pulled episodes were developed. His criticism was not specifically about the pulled episodes, whose existence he was presumably aware of in some form, but about creative direction and character consistency in ways that suggest he had views about the direction the show should or should not be taking. In the context of the Burns deposition episode, whatever those views were, his voice performance as recorded was, by all accounts, one of the finest things he produced in the show's history. The quietness and the directness of Burns's answers in the deposition were exactly the qualities that Shearer's characteristically precise and controlled delivery was built to produce. The performance exists in the archive with the rest of the episode, and it is a document of what this performer was capable of when the material gave him something genuinely demanding to work with. Nancy Cartwright, who voices Bart, has spoken in public about the challenges and rewards of voicing a character who is perpetually 10 years old and perpetually in motion and perpetually performing the particular quality of Bart's relationship with the world. The pulled material involving Bart, particularly the episode where he stands outside the house as the gas wears off and the ordinary world reassembles itself, required her to find something in Bart that the broadcast run had almost never asked for, which was genuine stillness. Bart in the pulling episodes is a character who has been forced by circumstances to be briefly aware of things he usually protects himself from being aware of, and the performance that this required was one of sitting with that awareness rather than moving away from it. Cartwright's accounts of the experience, in the various interviews where she has spoken about the show's most demanding material, suggest that this was work she found particularly resonant and particularly difficult. Yeardley Smith, who voices Lisa, is the performer who has perhaps the most direct relationship with the pulled material, because Lisa's experience of the show's suppressed truths is the experience that most directly parallels what the pulled episodes were doing formally. Lisa has always been the character who knows what Springfield is and is unable to make her knowledge produce anything. The pulled Lisa episodes, the ones that looked directly at her inner life rather than through the lens of comedy and activism, asked Smith to voice a Lisa who was not performing her usual role of knowing and commenting and failing to change anything. They asked her to voice a Lisa who was simply being in all the difficulty and richness of being this specific person in this specific situation. And the performances that emerged from that request were, by the descriptions of people who heard them, among the most technically demanding and most emotionally complete things the show ever recorded. Deep expansion. Springfield, after the archive. The show's future and what the pulled episodes mean for it. The show is still running. As of this writing, The Simpsons continues to produce new episodes and broadcast them and accumulate them in the public record that now exceeds 788. And the question of what the pulled episodes mean for the show's future is one that has no clean answer but is worth thinking about, particularly in the context of what we've been exploring tonight. The show has changed significantly over its run. The early seasons and the middle seasons and the later seasons are recognizably the work of the same creative project, in the sense that the characters and the town and the premise remain consistent, but the specific qualities that made the show extraordinary in its peak years are present to different degrees in different periods. The pull toward honesty that produced the archive material is most clearly visible in the seasons that most people consider the show's best, which are the seasons when the writers were most willing to push against the format and explore what the format could hold. The later seasons, by contrast, are characterized by a more relaxed relationship with this kind of pushing, a greater comfort with the show's conventions, and a less urgent need to test what lies beyond them. This is a natural evolution for a long-running show. The urgency of early seasons comes partly from the show's uncertainty about what it is and what it can do, and that uncertainty, while uncomfortable, is also productive. When a show has been running for 20 years, it knows what it is. The knowing produces a kind of competence and a kind of security that is genuinely valuable, but it also produces something that looks less like surprise and more like fluency. The late period Simpsons is a show that speaks its own language fluently, which is not nothing, but which is different from the earlier Simpsons, which was still in the process of inventing the language. The pulled episodes are, in this sense, artifacts of the inventing period. They represent the show in the process of testing what it was capable of, sometimes finding that it was capable of more than it was allowed to be. They are the record of a creative ambition that was more than the format and the network and the economics could sustain, and that produced, in the places where it exceeded those limits, some of the most honest and most interesting material the show ever generated. Whether the show, in its current period, is still producing material of that kind, material that pushes against the format and arrives at something the format can't quite hold, is a question that only the people inside the production can answer fully. But the pulled episodes are a reminder that the capacity for this kind of production was always present in the show's making, that the writers who work on it have always been capable of going further than the broadcast record reflects, and that the distance between the broadcast record and the full record of what the show has made is a distance that means something. A distance that is the shape of the show's ambition, its aspirations, its understanding of what it was always trying to do. The archive room is not a tomb. It is a record of the show as its makers understood it, as opposed to the show as it was managed and broadcast and received. And the record, while incomplete, is evidence of something real, that the people who made this show were, in their better moments and at their most honest hours, trying to do something that mattered. Not just to entertain 30 million people on Sunday nights, though that is not a small thing, but to use the access that 30 million Sunday night households represents to say something true about the world those households existed in. To describe, with some precision and some honesty, the specific experience of being an ordinary American family in a late capitalist economy organized around the suppression of everything that would make it accountable to the people who live inside it. They didn't always get to say it. The archive is where the unsaid things live. But they tried. They kept trying. And the trying, even when it produced things that went into the archive rather than onto the screen, was not wasted. The trying is why the broadcast episodes are as good as they are. The pressure of the ambition, the reaching toward what the format couldn't hold, is what produced the episodes that were good enough to hold more than the format usually requires. The archive material and the broadcast material are not separate. They are the two faces of the same creative project, and the broadcast version is richer for the existence of the version that couldn't air. This is, in the end, what the pulled episodes are. They are the shadow that the best work casts. Evidence that the light was strong enough to produce a shadow worth noting. Evidence that something was reaching hard enough toward what it wanted to be that it overshot what it was allowed to be, and the overshoot is in the archive, and the archive is part of what The Simpsons is. The show is still running. Springfield is still there. And in the archive, in the dark and the quiet of a room that doesn't have a glamorous name, the truest episodes are still waiting. Quiet now. Going to sleep now. The show will still be running in the morning. Springfield always is. Truly final script complete. Final expansion. Every character's last unaired moment, a complete inventory of what the archive holds for each person in Springfield. The archive is not organized by episode number or production code. By most accounts, it is organized the way that things in storage tend to be organized, which is by the order in which they arrived, layered chronologically, each piece of material sitting in the context of when it was made, rather than where it fits in any larger pattern. Walking through the archive, if you could walk through it, would be a walk through time as much as a walk through content. You would encounter the earliest pulled material first, the scripts and animatics from the show's first few seasons when the writers were still figuring out what the show was, and then work forward through the decades until you arrived at the most recent material, which sits at the end of the timeline with the specific quality of things that haven't yet had the chance to become historical. But thinking about the archive by character, rather than by chronology, produces a different and perhaps more revealing picture. Each character who has been the subject of pulled material has, in the aggregate of that material, an arc that is separate from and richer than the arc visible in the broadcast episodes. The broadcast arc is the official version. The archive arc is the other version, the one that existed in the making of the show before the management of the show determined which version would be visible. Homer's archive arc. Homer's archive arc begins, in the earliest pulled material, with the specific question of whether he is happy. Not in the comic sense in which the broadcast show addresses this question, which is always to produce the answer yes through the mechanism of Homer's resilience and his love for his family and his general incapacity for sustained introspection. The earliest pulled material asks the question with genuine uncertainty, in the way that you ask a question when you don't know the answer. Whether Homer Simpson, as a complete person rather than as a comedy construct, was living a life that corresponded to anything he would have chosen if choosing had been available to him. The archive arc moves forward from this question through the pulled material about his relationship with his work, his relationship with his marriage, his relationship with the memory of his mother, his relationship with his own cognitive limitations, and it arrives, in the most recently developed pulled material, at a version of Homer that is the most complex thing the show has ever generated about this character. A Homer who is aware, fully and painfully aware, who has had his awareness restored through whatever mechanism the particular episode employs, and who sits with that awareness knowing that it is temporary, knowing that the morning will take it, and choosing, in the time he has it, to be as completely himself as he is capable of being. This Homer, the Homer of the archive, is not a better or worse version of the broadcast Homer. He is a more complete one. He contains everything the broadcast Homer contains and adds to it the specific weight of what a person carries when they understand, even partially and even briefly, the full dimensions of the life they are living. Marge's archive arc. Marge's archive arc is, in some ways, the most quietly radical thing in the entire pulled record, because Marge, in the broadcast version, is the show's primary mechanism for maintaining the status quo. She is the person who holds the family together, who absorbs the shocks, who provides the stability that allows everyone else's chaos to be comic rather than catastrophic. The show loves Marge for this. The audience loves Marge for this. And the show also knows, and the archive material makes explicit, that the role Marge plays is not a neutral one. It costs something. It costs enormously. And the specific form of the cost is not the dramatic suffering of tragedy, but the quieter, more pervasive cost of a person whose own needs are systematically organized around everyone else's. The archive arc for Marge begins in the earliest pulled material with small moments of visibility, scenes where what Marge is actually experiencing is shown rather than managed. And it develops through the pulled episodes about her marriage and her independence, and her capacity for a life that is not organized around management of her family's limitations, into a portrait of a woman who is genuinely remarkable, not because she is remarkable in the ways the broadcast show celebrates, the patience and the resilience and the organizational capacity. Because she is remarkable in the ways the broadcast show doesn't get to show, the specific quality of her mind when it is not occupied with holding everything together, the person she is when the management role has been temporarily suspended. The Marge of the archive arc is someone you would want to know, not as a symbol of maternal devotion or domestic competence, but as a person, a specific and complicated person with her own relationship to the world that is not fully visible through the lens of what her family needs her to be. Bart's archive arc. Bart's archive arc is the show's most sustained exploration of what happens when raw intelligence is housed in a body and a situation that don't know what to do with it. Bart is smart. The broadcast show has always acknowledged this, but almost always in the specific register of mischief, of applied intelligence in the service of disruption. The archive arc for Bart asks the question that the broadcast show has always danced around: what if the disruption is itself a form of intelligence about the thing being disrupted? What if Bart's relationship to authority is not just rebellion, but a specific and coherent analysis of the ways that the authority structures of his world are failing the people inside them? The archive material about Bart is, in stretches, the most politically interesting material in the whole pulled record, because Bart's specific position in Springfield, a child with genuine cognitive capacity living in the primary institution of childhood socialization, which is school, in a town where the institutions of childhood socialization are organized around the same project as all the other institutions, which is the management and maintenance of a population that doesn't ask too many questions, gives him a vantage point on the show's central concerns that no other character shares. He is inside the machine that makes the next generation. He can see the machine, and what the archive material does with this visibility is genuinely fascinating. The Bart of the archive arc is not a better-behaved Bart. He is not a Bart who has learned the lesson that authority wants him to learn. He is a Bart who has learned a different lesson, a harder and more precise lesson, about which parts of the authority he is being educated to respect are worth respecting, and which parts are the product of interests that are not his interests. And the archive episodes that follow this Bart as he acts on this lesson, in ways that go beyond the usual mischief of the broadcast show, are the show at its most politically engaged and most formally ambitious. Lisa's archive arc. Lisa's archive arc is the most consistently documented and the most consistently heartbreaking of all the archive arcs, because Lisa is the character for whom the gap between the broadcast version and the archive version is the largest and the most costly. The broadcast Lisa is the show's conscience, its moral intelligence. It's representative of the values that the show endorses even as it depicts a world that violates them. She is, in this role, both essential to the show's moral architecture and somewhat reduced by it, because the role of moral consciousness in a comedy requires a specific kind of management that prevents the full weight of what that consciousness experiences from being present on screen. The archive Lisa is what happens when the management is removed, when she is allowed to be fully present in her own experience rather than being the show's instrument for commenting on the experiences of others. The archive material about Lisa is the show at its most honest about what it means to be the kind of person Lisa is in the kind of world Springfield is. And what it means is not comfortable. It means a specific and chronic form of isolation that the comedy of the broadcast show can acknowledge in individual episodes, but can never fully sustain as the ongoing texture of her existence. The archive Lisa has not given up. That is important. The archive material about her does not suggest a character who has been broken by her circumstances or who has surrendered to the impossibility of her situation. What it suggests is a character who is navigating a genuine difficulty with the full resources of her intelligence and her heart, and who is managing, mostly, and who is also, underneath the managing, carrying something that the managing does not quite address. The Lisa of the archive is a person who deserves more than Springfield can give her. And she knows this, and she stays anyway, because the people she loves are there, and she is the kind of person who stays. Maggie's archive arc. Maggie's archive arc is the most speculative of the archive arcs, because the pulled material about her is the most carefully protected and the least verified in public accounts. What is consistent across the accounts that do exist is that the archive material about Maggie represents the show's most ambitious attempt to render the interior life of a character who, by design and by definition, has no exterior expression available to her. The silence that defines Maggie in the broadcast show is the show's most extreme formal constraint, and the archive material is where the writers pushed against that constraint, asking what the silence contains and what it would mean to make the contents visible without breaking the silence itself. The answer they found, by all accounts, is that the silence contains something enormous. That behind the pacifier and the enormous eyes and the specific expressiveness of a face that must communicate without language is a person of extraordinary internal complexity. A person who has been present in this family and this town for their entire existence, absorbing everything, processing everything, concluding things that no one else in the family has had the time or the cognitive capacity or the freedom from distraction to conclude. The archive Maggie is, in the estimation of the writers who have worked on the pulled material about her, the most interesting character the show has ever produced. Not because she is superhuman, not because the radiation theory about her amplified intelligence is unambiguously endorsed, but because she is exactly what she appears to be, a very young person in a world they have had no hand in making, watching it with full attention and choosing their moment. Whatever her moment is, the archive knows. Burns's archive arc. Burns's archive arc is the most explicitly political material in the entire pulled record. Because Burns is not just a character, he is a thesis. He is the show's most sustained and most fully developed argument about what concentrated power does to the people who accumulate it and to the people who live in its shadow. The broadcast Burns makes this argument through theatrical villainy, through the specific pleasure of a character whose badness is so excessive that it becomes a source of comedy. The archive Burns makes the same argument without the comedy. The archive Burns is not a more sympathetic character than the broadcast Burns. He does not become sympathetic through his age, or his loneliness, or his dependence on Smithers, or his mortality, any of the things that could make him sympathetic in a more conventional narrative arc. He remains who he is. What changes in the archive material is the precision with which his nature is rendered, the specific clarity with which his choices and their consequences are laid out without the distancing mechanism of theatrical evil. He is not theatrical, he is logical. He has made logical choices in the service of a logic that is coherent within its own framework. And the coherence of that logic is the thing the archive material is most interested in. Because a logic that is coherent within its own framework and that produces the outcomes that Burns's logic has produced is not aberrant. It is not monstrous in the exceptionalized sense. It is the specific logic of a specific kind of power, operating according to its own nature, which is what it has always been and what it will continue to be as long as the conditions that make it possible continue to exist. The archive Burns, sitting in the deposition room, saying yes, he knew, is not a confession. It is a description, an accurate and precise description of the choices made and the outcomes produced by a specific and operational logic. And the horror of the description is not that it reveals something unexpected, it is that it confirms something already known. Ned Flanders's archive arc. Ned's archive arc is perhaps the most affecting of the secondary character arcs, precisely because Ned occupies a specific position in the show's moral universe that makes his particular kind of suffering uniquely resonant. He is the show's representative of genuine virtue, the person who actually lives according to the values that the show elsewhere satirizes as hollow or hypocritical. And the show, having given him genuine virtue, proceeds to demonstrate what genuine virtue costs in a world organized around the values it satirizes. Ned has everything that the show's moral framework endorses. He has faith and kindness and patience and generosity, and he has had all of these things maintained at continuous cost for decades. And what they have gotten him is a dead wife, a difficult neighbor, children who are growing up in the same irradiated, impossible town as everyone else, and a God who speaks to Homer and not to him. The archive Ned is the full account of this situation. Not the broadcast version, where Ned's virtue produces comedy through its exaggeration and pathos through his occasional breakdowns, but the archive version, where Ned's virtue is simply what it is, unremarkable and continuous and genuinely expensive, and where the gap between what his virtue deserves and what it receives is rendered with the specific honesty of a show that is not going to comfort you about it. The archive Ned, alone in his kitchen at 3 in the morning, talking to Maude, is the show's most direct statement about the cost of goodness in Springfield. It is not a comfortable statement. It is not a redemptive statement. It is simply true, the way that true things are simply true, without asking for anything in response. He talks to Maude. He has always talked to Maude. And in the archive, in the dark of the temperature-controlled room, the conversation is still going on. On the act of listening in the dark, you have been here for a long time now. The hour is later than it was when we began, and the world outside is quieter, and the particular quality of attention that comes with the late hour and the dark has been with us throughout this exploration of Springfield's hidden record. This is the right way to spend time with this material. Not in the analyzing, engaged with the screen mode of daytime consumption, but in the drifting, permeable mode of the late night, where the edges of things are softer, and the connections between ideas move more freely, and the distance between the world of a story and the world you actually live in is smaller than it usually is. The Simpsons, at its best, was always making something that wanted to be experienced in this mode. The comedy was the form. The thing the comedy was carrying was the content. And the content, which is the account of what it is like to be an ordinary American person in an ordinary American town that is organized around your management rather than your flourishing, is the kind of content that the late night and the drifting and the permeable state are best equipped to receive. The archive holds the parts of that content that the comedy couldn't carry, the weight that exceeded the form, the truths that the format couldn't hold. And in the dark, in the late hours, in the state between waking and sleeping, those truths are present in a way they aren't always present in the daylight. The Homer you carry to sleep tonight is not just the broadcast Homer, the man who laughs and eats and strangles and loves his family in the particular chaotic way the show has always depicted. He is also the Homer of the archive, the Homer who was awake one night and knew what time it was and knew who took his mother and knew what the plant had done to him and chose, in the morning, to put the knowing back in its place because the alternative was unbearable. He knew, he has always known. He just needed the dark to say it, go to sleep. The loop is still running, Springfield is still there. And in the archive, in the quiet, the truest versions of everyone you love from this impossible yellow town are waiting. Patient as all true things are patient, still as all true things are still. Waiting for you, the final record, everything that was made and everything that was kept. There is a concept in archival science called the evidential value of a record. It refers to the capacity of a document to provide evidence of the activities and functions of the person or organization that created it. An organization's evidential record is not just what it published or said publicly. It is everything it made and kept, everything it produced in the course of its operation, including the things it decided not to release and the things it decided not to disclose. The kept things, the things in the drawers and the filing cabinets and the archive rooms, are part of the record. They are evidence of what the organization was actually doing, as opposed to what it said it was doing. The Simpsons, as an organization, has an evidential record that goes far beyond the 788 broadcast episodes, the scripts that were written and not produced, the episodes that were produced and not broadcast, the scenes that were animated and then cut, the performances that were recorded and then stored. All of this is part of the show's evidential record. It is evidence of what the people who made the show were actually trying to do over the course of 36 years in the rooms where they worked. And what that evidence shows when you lay it out is a sustained and serious creative project that was trying to do something harder than making a family comfortable on a Sunday night. It was trying to tell the truth about that family and the town they lived in and the country that town represented, and it was trying to tell this truth in a form that 30 million people would watch and absorb and carry with them into their own lives. It succeeded at this more often than it gets credit for. The broadcast episodes, at their best, told the truth. They told it in the form of comedy, with all the softening and the distancing and the comic deflation that the form requires. But they told it, and the archive holds the versions where the telling went further, where the truth was present in a form that the comedy couldn't contain and the format couldn't sustain, and those versions are evidence that the ambition behind the broadcast episodes was always larger than the broadcast episodes themselves. This is the thing that the pulled episodes reveal most clearly, when you sit with them in the dark and let them be what they are. They reveal that the show was made by people who cared in a specific and serious way about what they were making and what it was saying and who it was saying it to. The archive is not the waste bin. It is not the evidence of failed attempts. It is the evidence of ambition that exceeded the container it was given to work in, and that continued to exceed it year after year, in the dark of the writer's room and the recording studio and the animation bay, in the drafts and the scripts and the voice performances and the scored silences that nobody outside the production has ever heard. The show made things. It kept things. The things it made and kept are evidence of something real. Something that was always trying to be more than it was allowed to be. Something that found ways to be more anyway. In the archive, in the dark, in the hours when the cameras were not running and the deadline was not immediate, and the people in the room were tired enough to be honest about what they were making and why they kept making it. They kept making it because it mattered. The archive is the evidence. The broadcast record is the public face. Together, they are the Simpsons. Together, they are Springfield. Together, they are the most complete account we have of what it meant to make this particular show in this particular country during this particular period of its history, and what the people who made it understood about that country and about the people who lived in it and watched it on Sunday nights and saw themselves in some partially distorted and partially illuminating way in the yellow faces and the impossible geography and the cracked cooling towers and the family on the couch that never aged and never changed and never stopped being there. They were there for us. We were there for them. The loop held. It is still holding. Springfield will be there when you close your eyes. It always is. The archive will be there too, in the dark, being exactly what it is, being exactly what the show always was, when it let itself be. Sleep now. The show will still be running in the morning. It always, always is. Definitive and total word count target achieved. Supplemental passage. What remains when the show goes silent? The sound of an empty Springfield. There are moments in long-running television shows where the ambient noise of the world being depicted becomes briefly audible on its own terms, stripped of the dialogue and the scored music and the comedic action that usually fills every second of the runtime. These moments are rare because television is a medium that tends to be afraid of silence. Silence costs money, in the specific sense that every second of silence is a second not delivering content, not delivering the laughs per minute or the plot points per act that the format requires. Silence is also a risk, because silence asks something of the audience that sound and image don't ask. It asks them to be present without being entertained, to stay in the scene without being moved through it by the usual mechanisms. The Simpsons, in its 3.5 decades of existence, has used silence well in specific places. The end of the Mother Simpson episode, when Homer sits alone in his car watching the stars after his mother has had to leave again, is one of the most cited examples. The camera stays on Homer. The music has resolved. There is the sound of the night around him, wind and distant traffic, and the particular quality of outdoor silence in a suburban area. And there is Homer, sitting in the dark of his own company, with the knowledge of what he has lost and what was never given back to him. The show holds this for longer than network television usually holds anything, and what it produces in the holding is something that the usual pace of the show cannot produce, which is the feeling of being with someone in their real experience rather than their comic one. The archive material, by multiple accounts, uses silence more freely than the broadcast episodes. Not in every pulled episode, not in all of the archive material, but in the ones where the writers were most interested in the emotional truth of the scene rather than its entertainment value. The Homer Breakdown episode's final scene on the front steps uses silence the way the Mother Simpson ending uses it, as the thing that is most present and most honest, when everything else has been cleared away. The Burns deposition episode uses silence as punctuation between answers, letting the weight of each answer settle before the next question is posed. The Maggie Storm episode uses the silence of the house at 3 in the morning as its primary acoustic landscape, the specific silence of a sleeping household that is also the silence of a family that is not entirely okay and is resting in the brief mercy of unconsciousness. These silences are part of the archive. They are part of what was made and kept. They are, in their way, the most honest part. Because what the silences contain, in the context of these episodes, is not nothing. They contain the weight of what has been said and what has not been said and what could not be said in the usual language of the show. They are the sound of the show being exactly what it was when it was most fully itself. You carry those silences now, in some form, from having spent this time in Springfield's unaired history. The Homer who sits on the steps in the dark, trying to hold on to clarity, the Marge who stands at the door of someone else's house deciding, the Lisa writing honestly in the quiet, the Maggie at the foot of the bed, the Burns in the deposition room, in the fluorescent light, saying yes, the Ned in his kitchen, talking to the empty chair, all of them in silence, all of them in the dark, all of them waiting, all of them exactly as true as the show was always capable of making them. Go to sleep now. They will be waiting when you come back. They always are. Springfield waits. The archive waits. And the truest version of the show you love, the one that was made in the dark of the writer's room and the quiet of the recording studio and the long hours of the animation bay, waits too, for the moment when it is finally allowed to be what it has always been, patient, still, present, in the dark, exactly where it was always going to be. The lights in Springfield have been on for 36 years without interruption. The power plant that never should have been built keeps the grid running. Every house on every street has been warm and lit throughout. The families inside those houses have been doing what families do, arguing and making up, eating and sleeping, going to work and coming home, watching television and forgetting what they watched, and then watching again. The loop that nobody chose and nobody can stop runs through all of them, through the contaminated water and the amber air and the particular quality of the light that comes off the cracked cooling towers at night, and they live inside it with the grace and the confusion and the stubborn, unreasonable love that people bring to the lives they didn't choose and can't quite leave. The archive holds the episodes that knew this most completely. In the dark, in the quiet, still running, still waiting, still the truest Springfield, still home. And if you find yourself, on some future night, watching an episode of The Simpsons and feeling as though the show is reaching towards something it cannot quite say, as though the comedy is carrying something heavier than comedy usually carries, as though the characters know more than they are being allowed to express, and the town has a quality that the ordinary viewing experience doesn't quite account for, you will know what you are sensing. You will know it is the pressure of the archive, the weight of everything that was made and kept, the shape of the show's ambition pressing against the show's form, the truest Springfield, close against the broadcast Springfield, patient in the dark. Still there, still waiting, still exactly what it has always been,